And so I'd like to welcome everybody to the G7 Global Strategy Meeting, which is taking place over an extended period. We have today, the 10th of November, which is kind of our politics and policy discussion, where we're going to be looking at where the G7 is sitting in today's multilateral system. We're going to be looking at what the UK and US presidencies, the remainder of the US presidency is looking at, and then go on to take a look at some of the policy areas from what we hear is on the agenda for the UK government, but also what we are seeing as key issues to be presented as policy areas. And as I said, in a lot of the information sent out for this meeting, a lot of the focus is on convergence. We have to take a look at how do we ensure that the big dominant events of 2021, which we presume will be climate and COVID and pandemic, how do we work with these two big monoliths and work within all our sessions, all our different issues, so they have voice and resonate beyond just those two big issues. So that's kind of what we're going to be looking at today. To kick off, though, I'm delighted that Stephanie Draper, the Chief Executive of Bond, has been able to join us. Bond, as you know, is one of the development umbrella network for the UK and one of the big players in the G7 and working with the government, planning for that event. And so Stephanie has very kindly come on board to have to share some words with us. And I'm going to ask Stephanie, yes, thank you, if you can unmute yourself and open your video, which I've seen you done. Again, just to reiterate for those who just joined, for the first two sessions, we're going to ask everyone to use the video off and muted, except for those who are speaking in the panels. Please use the chat or Jamboard to share questions or answers. And then we can go back from that. John, can I ask you to turn your video off, please? And if you do speaker view, that way you'll have Stephanie or whoever's asking questions will turn up. So just go to speaker view and we should be ready. And welcome, Peter. I'm just gonna ask you.
Good morning, Cal. How are you? Can you hear me all right?
We can. Peter,
Okay.
I'm going to start with Stephanie Draper from Bond, who's going to give us a welcome, a couple words, and then we'll pass over to you.
Thank you.
Great. Stephanie.
Great. Hello, everyone. So it's great to be here, and thank you, Cal. And it's fantastic to be sort of pulling together the strategy for the G7, which obviously we are very involved in because we're hosting the C7 and keen to make that a really participative and meaningful process. I am just going to say a few things about what the G7 looks like in the UK based on the conversations that we've been having with the UK government, but I think you'll be hearing from my colleague Kit later about the detail on that. So all I want to say is that we at Bond are taking this very seriously because the UK government, we think, is taking it fairly seriously. Next year is the year that the UK will show itself to be, show its international colours afresh post-Brexit. And so the G7 is the first moment that Joe Biden is going to come to UK soil, we expect. So it will be a key political and media moment. And also it will be about how does the UK show up as a nation independent of Europe, whatever we think about that. So they are seeing it like that, and that means that there is going to be investment in making something meaningful happen, which is hopefully good news for all of us. So that's really key. In terms of what we're seeing and what our priorities are, the conversations have been very focused clearly on economic recovery post-COVID and on health. So ensuring a green and inclusive recovery, inclusive of tax and trade, is going to be a very central tenet to the way that G7 works, making progress on climate action as part of that now rises up the agenda with the changes in the US this weekend. So that obviously gives us a great deal more potential. Health and education system strengthening are still very much on the agenda, and education being a core part of the UK government's manifesto and something that they're very committed to making good progress on. And then the final two that are standing out for me are around food and nutrition and open societies. We hear that the UK government is talking about whether the G7 should become the D7 and be talking about democratic societies coming together and shaping their and playing their role in the world. So I think democracy and everything that has happened around that will also be a key part of the agenda, which hopefully should lead to good engagement from civil society and from the other sevens that are represented here. So I think we should treat this strategy session as an opportunity to shape a strategy that has potential to really land and make a difference in a way that perhaps, it certainly hasn't through the US presidency. And so it's something we should take seriously and hopefully is a real opportunity to get some progress on key areas. So good luck with the strategy, and I look forward to hearing and seeing how it evolves.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Stephanie. I appreciate you taking the time to come along and share those thoughts with us today. And that goes down to exactly what we're here to do for the next period, to delve down in those details and to get more understanding of how we're going to influence the G7 after a fairly fallow year and hopefully a more effective year in 2021. But before we do that, as we take a look at the global agenda, and now with President Biden hopefully coming into office, we looking at multilateralism and where does the G7 fit into that? How does G7 influence nowadays compared to previous times? And where does it sit in the evolving global governance that we face today? I'm very pleased to have Peter Beam join us. For those of you who've been doing G7s for some time, you'll know that Peter has been the Canadian G7 G8 Sherpa since 2013 through to the Canadian Summit at Charlevoix in 2018, where he was the Deputy Minister and Personal Representative of the Prime Minister. Peter also, before that, was the Ambassador to Germany and held Deputy Minister at Foreign Affairs, the Department for Foreign Affairs, or Global Affairs as it's called today. But since 2019, he's been elevated to the Senate and speaks to us as a senator from Ottawa. So Peter, thank you very much for joining us. Really looking forward to hearing what your experience at G7 and what you think of the G7's role going forward in today's climate. So hand over to you, Peter, for give us your keynote speech, and then we'll come back to the panel. So welcome.
Thank you very much, Kel, and good morning, everyone. And I'm speaking to you from the unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation in Ottawa, and it's very early in the morning here, and the garage door downstairs into the parking lot did not work, so I rushed here after getting security. I'm happy to be with all of you today. I know we're spanning the globe, which is why it's just after 7 a.m. here, and I'm delighted that it's this sort of a consultation and discussion. I'd like to thank in particular Kel Curra and Lauren Dobson Hughes for inviting me, for their dedication, their involvement, which I've witnessed for the past couple of years, and I admire what they do and indeed what all of you do. So we are, I think, at an inflection point in the G7. Indeed, we're at an inflection point in terms of global multilateralism. Why? A number of reasons. The pandemic certainly stands out, and the regular travel and meeting schedule that so many people have relied upon in terms of conducting their consultations, that appears to be very much curtailed, and it's not clear when that is going to come back. And that's why many big international meetings have been postponed, have had different venues. I'm thinking in particular of the high-level week at the General Assembly of the UN in New York, but certainly COP in Glasgow has been postponed by a year. I'll come back to COP a little bit later. So we have that crisis, and also then combined with that, over the past few years, a shrinking commitment to multilateral interaction, led first and foremost by Donald Trump and his administration, which has also had a very significant impact. It is an impact that has grown over time, in that the very foundations of the international institutions that the United States tried to create post-war seem to be crumbling. The US has not seen these institutions as useful. And if you've paid attention to the election campaign in the US, as I'm sure you have, Mr. Biden has said that he wants to work more closely with allies. He wants to work more closely with organizations. For me personally, and I'm sure for many of you, the thought of pulling funding and pulling out of the World Health Organization in the midst of a pandemic, a once in a century pandemic like we have now, is sheer madness. And that was a very unfortunate thing, because it also signals then to some other countries who do not have such a faith in multilateral work that they too can do this, or these institutions should not be taken seriously. Some of them suffer from underfunding, as the WHO does, but that is a cause for some concern. So this also applies not just to the multilateral institutions that perhaps you are all most familiar with, but also the international financial institutions, who are going to be key in terms of helping many countries, especially those countries who may have become or be on the verge of being middle income countries and have moved from ODA recipient status. Some of them might slip back. Some of them might need more development assistance. I'll come back to development assistance as well a little bit later on in my remarks. So this is a very critical time. So why the G7? Well, in my experience, my first G7 was in 1994. Some of you may not have been on the planet then, but I was the director for our G7 division. And I went with Jean Chrétien, who was then our prime minister, to his first G7 meeting in Naples, in Italy. And then the following year, Canada hosted in 1995 in Halifax. And at that point, there had been changes in Russia, and it was decided that Boris Yeltsin would be invited in, but only for the dinner. But by the following year, when the summit was in Lyon, it was already virtually a G8. And then, of course, that changed in 2013 when Mr. Putin decided to send his troops into Ukraine and seize Crimea. And the other countries felt that this action was not compatible with being part of the G8 as it then was. And that was the last summit of the G8 was in fact at Lough Erne in Northern Ireland. So that has been sort of my range. What I have seen evolve during this period is a commitment to dialogue amongst leaders. And so the UK summit is going to be key, because I don't know what dates have been set, and I'm no longer an insider in terms of seeing all of the information. But it could very well be the very last summit for the doyenne of the G7, and that is Angela Merkel, who has witnessed it all. And it may surprise some of you that the second most senior person is Justin Trudeau, with the departure of Shinzo Abe from the scene. So there are new actors, and there is perhaps a new way of doing things. But this informality is very important, because if you look at it, you get your leaders together for a day and a half to look at various issues that Sherpas will have prepared. but also in some cases, in most cases, there have been some ministerial meetings beforehand. So the terrain is prepared for discussion, and the whole idea is to demonstrate some solidarity among advanced economies, democratic nations, in terms of dealing with the here and now, but also looking towards the future. So when we hosted in 2018, the idea was to sensitize everyone to an agenda that was going to be fleshed out in a series of ministerial meetings, in the Sherpa meetings that I chaired, and certainly then in the interactions that Mr. Trudeau had with leaders. But to do that, you have to plan early, and I'm encouraged to hear that the UK is doing that, because a characteristic of the United States all the way through has been not much planning early. Why? Because it's the U.S. It doesn't really matter who's in power, but it's the last few weeks or the last couple of months where the Americans then get into gear. So even before we took the chair from Italy, this is in the fall of 2017, I went to all capitals, paid particular attention to the White House, because I knew that US decisions on policy and other things would come later in the game, that there were a few issues that were difficult for the United States, climate change being one, because we'd seen a preview of that at Taormina, which was the summit before, but that took place before President Trump decided to pull the US out of the Paris Agreement. And we knew that issues that where we, as Canada, placed a lot of value, gender equality, for example, more development assistance for women in the health field, that would raise the SRHR concern that the US would have a problem with, because anything that gets close to women's right to choose makes them very, very nervous. So we knew all of that, and we began to think about what initiatives we could take forward. So the planning stage is very very important, as is the execution stage for ministerial meetings in particular. And so what we decided to do, and I think France emulated that in the following year, was to have ministerial meetings in parallel on key themes, and then have a joint session. So for example, in terms of the workforce of the future, which was one of our themes, we had a meeting of labor ministers and then a meeting of economic development ministers at the same time, and they had a joint session for a few hours, because this is an issue and a theme important to both, but the languages are essentially different. The policy language is different. So too with finance ministers and international development ministers, the idea being there are finite resources out there for official development assistance. Let's see how we can leverage banks, private funds, everything, to get more money out there so we can realize the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. So too with foreign ministers and national security ministers or interior ministers on the issues of cyber terrorism and the like, that are foreign, but they are also security. And we did the same thing in terms of pushing forward the ocean plastics charter by having a meeting of fisheries ministers for those countries who had them, with environment ministers or energy ministers, depending on the relationship in any particular country. So that helped to set the tone. What I think is happening is perhaps less of a reliance on the actual physical meetings, and we have that now because we've had to meet virtually, and Sherpas meet virtually, and perhaps toning down the event a little bit. So the summit itself becomes a huge thing. Generally speaking, it works better if it's not in the middle of an urban center. We've seen that. We saw that the United States could not manage to get an agenda together, and really had more of a politicized approach that made everyone nervous. So for President Trump to invite leaders just ahead of an election, or to have a one-day meeting in Washington where they would all stay in the Trump International Hotel, this made other leaders nervous and were not practical because the agenda was never really clearly defined. So ideally, when a summit year works well, there are a lot of people who talk about the great summits of the past. I'm not going to blow the Canadian horn, but I think of Glen Eagles. I think of French leadership, particularly last year in difficult circumstances. Heiligendamm. You know, there are various things that summits that have worked quite well in terms of assessing the current situation and looking ahead to the future. So, for example, in Charlevoix in 2018, we wanted to muster more funding to help women and girls and their education in conflict zones throughout the world. We were having tremendous difficulty getting funding from our partners. And then, as fate would have it, I had a couple meetings with Kristalina Georgieva, then at the World Bank. And at the end of the day, we came up with $8 billion, which was not too shabby in my view. So I think if you look forward to things, you can then in the G7, it's not a form of global government, but it is influential because things can then spin into the G20, such as the $5 trillion of liquidity that were injected into the global economy because of COVID-19. And into the international institutions as well. If the two big themes that are emerging for the UK summit are in fact health, global health, and the economy, these are huge because we're in the middle of a pandemic, and this is what leaders should be focusing on in terms of looking ahead, making sure that the IFIs and the international institutions have what they need, that COVAX is up and running so everyone can get a vaccine, and that we stand behind it for the global common good. This is something the G7 can do. It can be influential in a way. I would submit that the G20 is not simply because of some of the actors around the table. And while we're on the subject of global health, why not clean up some of the other issues that have been hanging around for years, whether it is the prospect of other pandemics, whether it is neglected tropical diseases, which is a personal favorite of mine, because I think it just requires a small investment to move forward. This is an opportunity. So too on the economic side, here is an opportunity for the IMF, where of course Kristalina Georgieva now is the managing director, to really strut and see what it can do in terms of supporting developing countries and not putting too much conditionality on their indebtedness, because their indebtedness is going to increase as we move forward. So there's tremendous opportunity this year. There's a great potential, I think, for leadership. However, the problem is always getting leaders to focus, making sure that the ground is well prepared, and looking at initiatives that are ambitious but are also realistic. The last point I wanted to get into is the importance of the outreach consultations. I put a lot of stock in this from in our year from the beginning. I felt it was very important to consult with civil society all the way, and especially on the key themes. So we did invite civil society representatives to Sherpa meetings. We listened to their expertise. We did have the Gender Equality Advisory Council set up, also participate in meetings, and eventually had a breakfast with the leaders at Charlevoix at the summit itself. I put a lot of stock into the Youth 7, into the Y7, and one of my great personal delights, and you might expect this coming from a former ambassador to Germany, to see how one of the delegates, Luisa Neubauer, has done so exceptionally well as an advocate for climate change in Germany, and is also now a columnist for Stern magazine, which is relatively high circulation and popular in that country. So that's important. We got the T7, the Think 7 going as well. And that's professors and others who sometimes might have very lofty ideas, but it's if you don't have ideas, then you can't execute policies. So there's a lot of that. I put a big stock in that in terms of looking forward. The last point I want to make, and it's a difficult one, it's on the funding that will be required to really establish an aggressive global agenda to get out of this pandemic and also to revitalize economies. The rich countries have to do more. The tendency and its politics will be, well, why should we send money overseas when we've got all of these problems internally in our own countries? And in that respect, Canada is no different than the others. So it really is something that will require political will, and frankly, a lot of selling to populations of those donor countries. And what that means is you have to look at how to get more bang for your buck, as you, so to speak, as you look ahead. How can you make aid more effective, and how you can bring everyone along? And that is going to be the trick for all leaders. I would say it will be a particular challenge for Prime Minister Johnson hosting his first meeting and guiding his colleagues through the agenda. I would not underestimate the role of the host in terms of setting an agenda, in terms of pushing forward initiatives. It is very difficult. But the best thing is when everyone who comes to the table comes with good faith and comes prepared. And for the past few years, that has not always been the case. So maybe I'll stop there. I've thrown a few things out there. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much, Kel.
Excellent. Thank you, Peter, for that fantastic view of the G7 and some of the issues we're facing. And I think your last point, while a little, reality check for us, is that we are facing a lot of constraints around aid and a lot of demands on economic budgets as they go forward and repair after the pandemic. And that's going to be key. And our work is set to make that case and to push hard for some of the investment that we need. And I also like to attest the work that you did during the 2018 G7 on the outreach and engaging the different groups and bringing them on board and creating that dialogue between the Sherpas and civil society, which was key and really helpful to us. And I think we would love to see the UK replicate that. But of course, every presidency sets their own agenda and their own way of engagement. So we'll have to see. I'd just like to now bring on the two other panelists who are going to join us. We have Dr. Tristan Naylor, who is a fellow at International Relations at the LSE and also Deputy Director of the G7 G20 Research Group based in London. And also bringing on board Lauren Dawson-Hughes, who is a consultant working on international development issues, also based, like Peter, in Ottawa. Lauren has worked on a lot of G7s, including the 2018 G7, as well as a couple funding rounds, like the Global Fund replenishment round. So well experienced in influencing the G7. Tristan's going to give us an academic perspective, and Lauren's going to give us an NGO perspective. So I'm going to kick off with you first, Tristan, but just to remind everyone, please do start putting comments and questions into ideally the Jamboard, but also the chat if that's easier for you, and leave your name, and then we'll start accumulating them. And then after we have some words between Tristan and Lauren and some discussion with the panel, we will open it to questions. So without further ado, Tristan, do you want to give some thoughts and observations from your perspective?
Well, thanks very much, Kel, and indeed I'll give what thoughts I have. The broad brief you've given me is to share my insights on how the G7 sits in relative position to other groups in the overall global governance landscape. particularly with respect to the G20, and particularly with respect to what scope there is or might be, and what value there might be in G7 advocacy. So for sake of time, I'll just dive right in. In terms of the academic perspective, with very few exceptions, almost universally, the consensus is that the G7 is of significantly diminished relevance, power, and status in the contemporary global governance domain. The high watermark for the club was probably the mid-noughties. If you had to pick a summit, it'd probably be, as Peter just mentioned, Glen Eagles. And thereafter, particularly in the wake of the global financial crisis and the elevation of the G20 to the leaders' level, it's been, in relative terms, a steady decline for the import and authority of the G7 within the governance landscape. And so I think because of this sort of macro assessment, it's quite easy to dismiss the G7 as just not being worth the time, just not being worth the effort. And while I agree with this overall assessment, and indeed my own work has played a role in advancing this position, I'm not actually so quick to write off the G7, particularly as concerns civil society inclusion. And there are basically 5 reasons for this, which I will very briefly touch on each of them. 2 concern global symmetry broadly, and then 3 specifically concern the UK as the host in 2021. First, while the G7 might have this diminished status internationally, as a club, it remains a cohesive group of like-minded democracies, and hence the chatter right now about a transformation or the potential for a transformation into a D7. And not only is this a relatively cohesive group of like-minded democracies, they're ones who subscribe to a model of governance in which civil society does play a legitimate and necessary role. And simply put, this is not something that we have with the G20. While the Civil Society 20 is pretty much a staple part of the G20, there is very little evidence that civil society plays little more than a tokenistic window dressing role with the G20. In addition to work that I've done on this, a colleague of mine in Australia, Tom Chodor, just in the past couple of months has put out a really great piece that looks at exactly this, civil society inclusion, or really substantively lack thereof in the 20. This is not so with the 7, or at least not necessarily so. We, of course, have seen historically that civil society can play a substantive role in the entire G7 process. Again, I think the most illustrative, certainly the most off-cited case is Glen Eagles. And even when we look at just the past 2 or 3 G7 summits, I think it's quite clear from the agendas and the ways in which the outreach dimensions of the summit have both advanced and proliferated, that there is scope and a desire for substantive inclusion. So I'm not so quick to write the G7 off for that reason. Secondly, and somewhat related to the first point, the G7 is indeed in search of an identity and a purpose. The G7 is, to be frank, a bit listless. And as Stephanie pointed to, this is certainly driving, in a large part, the discussion surrounding the transformation of the G7, potentially towards a new identity as a D7 or a D10. The question that I am most asked, particularly since 2008, is, what's the G7 for? What's the point? Does it matter anymore? And there are a bevy of technocratic, bureaucratic, and functional answers to this that are valid and good. I think the G7 still matters. There are a bevy of answers that make sense in global capitals, but to the broader public, there is no resonant answer. In the eyes of the broader public, or rather broader publics, the G7 really does come across as little more than an indulgent talk shop of elites. And choosing optimism, I do see this as an opportunity never to let an identity crisis go to waste. And And when I think back to the last time in public perception terms that the G7 did have a resonant identity and defined purpose, it was in a large part because global civil society helped give it that identity and purpose. And again, I'll point to one of the examples that Peter noted. I think Gleneagles really is the paradigm exemplar here. Gleneagles is remembered as the summit for debt relief, and it's remembered as the Live 8 summit. These are two big legacies, and without civil society driving things in a substantive way, the summit would have neither of these legacies. What made Gleneagles significant, and indeed more broadly than this, what gave the G7 in the eyes of the public its sort of zenith moment as an institution, wasn't owing to the club in and of itself, but due to the value, to the pressure, to the advocacy of civil society that it brought to the group. And I think that's really quite significant. At, sort of zooming ahead 15 years, to today, the biggest and best boost that the G7 really could get right now in terms of sort of macro political terms is a broad social movement or a coalition thereof that can help give it this new direction, a new purpose, a new identity in the eyes of publics globally, which I'll come back to in a moment. But before I do so, turning to the 2021 summit specifically, I met with the G7 task force in the Cabinet Office here last week and learned quite a lot about the state of things for 2021, but just staying focused on the ways in which I think civil society can really add value. Just looking at those, the third reason that I'm optimistic is that the task force is keen on having substantive inclusion for local populations near the summit. This is actually in large part inspired by many of the things that Peter did working with populations in Quebec 2 years ago, something that I've spoken to the Cabinet Office here about at length. They are genuinely keen on this. Now, we can only know what exactly this would involve once the choice of the summit site is made public. But based on what is public now, the extent to which this is a priority and that they're still in the nascent stages of thinking about this means I think there is plenty of scope for involvement, for grassroots engagement. Fourth, the environment is going to be one of the priorities of the summit. The Cabinet Office Task Force sees the summit as a major stepping stone on the road to COP26, as a major way of branding the United Kingdom as an environmental power. Again, though, they are in the very early stages of thinking of quite what this will mean, quite what this will involve. And so there is an opportunity to shape things up front, as well as I suspect throughout the preparatory process and at the summit itself. It is potentially a big year in the G7 for the environmentally focused CSOs. And then the final thing that I want to point to is that the Prime Minister himself is personally insistent on the G7 being, and I'll quote him, a celebration of Britain. Now, if we sort of park the nationalism for a moment, there is, at least within the Cabinet Office, no substance to this directive yet, but that means that there is plenty of scope to shape quite what this would involve. And I think that this might actually be one of civil society's best bets to influence the summit this year, particularly when this particular government has so far demonstrated that it's not especially keen for direct policy engagement by the traditional channels. So, thinking of the likes of Global Citizen or One, I see that type of organization, very public-facing sort of advocacy campaign, does have the potential to play a role here within addressing this overall desire for a public celebration of sorts. Right, to wrap my sort of initial thoughts up, yes, the G7 in broad terms is very much of diminished status. But when it comes to civil society specifically, and the particular issues in which CSOs have a policy edge, I think there nonetheless remains significant opportunities in which CSOs might affect the club's trajectory, though albeit not perhaps through the formal policy channels. I think this holds true most immediately for 2021, but I think there is also a longer term possibility here as the club, or rather if the club is indeed renewed with a sense of purpose and identity. So at that, let me leave it there.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tristan, for those views, and great to have that perspective from your writing and research on the G7 and the G20 in relation to that. I want to introduce Lauren Duffin-Hughes to join us. I also have to admit that I have created what is effectively a Canadian panel, or a Canadian-British panel, and that was not really my plan to make it all Canadian, but I do think the world needs a bit more Canada in its life, so that's fine. So Lauren, hand over to you now.
I will do my best to bring out my British accent and not the awful slide into North Americanism that happens when you live here. Thanks, Kel. Some sort of thoughts from my side on the civil society angle and the advocacy. And I'm much less into the sort of lofty ideals thing and much more into the practicality of how are you going to do this thing. So some observations. It is an incredibly busy year next year with a number of milestones, and there is not a lot of money. There are, within the development space alone, there is GPE, there's the Health Summit, there's the Generation Equality Forum in June, and then there's COP alone. And so, as Peter alluded to, sort of ODA money is tight anyway. And then you have this sort of competition or collaboration or some version of how we work together. And so acknowledging that this is a very difficult year and we tend to get into our silos of, well, my issue is clearly the most important, while forgetting there's 16 other issues, all within the same development, social justice, progress space, all vying for essentially the same pot of money. And that governments, as Peter said, are under pressure for domestic spends. We've got the sort of the nice social justice piece of money, which in Canada is 0.5% of our COVID spend in Canada has been international. 99.5% of the COVID spend in Canada has been domestic. And it's a similar-ish proportion across. And so we're fighting amongst ourselves for a tiny slice of a pie. I always talk about advocacy in terms of, quite practically, what's the win? Why are you engaging in G7 advocacy, and what are you hoping to get out of it? Is it language in a declaration? Are you trying to reset norms after a very odd year? For climate groups or SRHR groups, are you looking to bring back, sort of a US role and reestablish back to international norms on issues that this year have backslid? Is it possible even to make progress on those? And then in this space, we often talk about accountability like the Holy Grail. And in, international politics, governance, accountability at an international level is elusive. And so thinking practically about what accountability looks like and how that actually is going to work. As others have said, there's a lot of discussion about Build Back Better, green, feminist, renewal. I think there is an onus on civil society then to have a better understanding of how financing flows work, how debt works, engaging with IFIs and development banks. I don't want to stereotype. There are some groups who do that and do that well, but traditionally it has not always been a strength of the sector. And I think this year, with tight money, it is going to be much more important for us to be able to come at that from a principled point of view, be that sort of gender-based analysis of financial flows, for example. And then finally, sort of, I think there's a lot of now we can go back to normal, or even think about these cool big ideas again now the US role has shifted. I actually sort of wonder if it was easier this year or in previous years to have this simple but bad dynamic where all you're doing is saying, like, you're asserting your basics: multilateralism good, alliances also good, destroying alliances bad. And so, that's quite an easy, it's frustrating because you're having to assert basic norms, but it's actually quite an easy position. And I'm wondering now if the dynamic shifts a little to the real complexities and the hard stuff in that, in the sort of gaps once you have technically a set of 8 Sherpas committed to democracy, that now we've got the hard granular stuff. So those are my thoughts, and I wanted to sort of punt something to Peter that's been on my brain. We've been talking, I've heard discussion this morning about, systemic change, building back better. This is a chance for like big renewal, D10s, D something, lots of letters and numbers, big systemic stuff. Is that actually my sense? My fear is that governments are tired. There is not a lot of bandwidth. The UK government particularly is running COP, GPE, G7, and attempting not to bankrupt itself with Brexit. Like, any one of those is quite likely enough to take up an entire government bandwidth, Brexit alone. So yeah, Peter, I guess your sense of like, is there actually capacity and bandwidth within governments that have been fighting COVID for 9 months now and are tired? Or is this actually a real chance? Are we genuinely looking at big structural or governance change or build back better? Where should our ambition level be?
Well, Lauren, how many hours do we have to discuss this? It's a very, very valid point. Over the years, there have been various suggestions. I recall Nicolas Sarkozy saying there should be a G13. And it's usually those who are new, who are coming in as leaders, who have the ideas that this should be somehow be different. So the only really other inflection points, to use the term again, that have occurred was when Russia was admitted, and then when Russia was kicked out. And the rest of the time, everyone seemed sort of satisfied with this taking place. And if it wasn't working for leaders, then we wouldn't have a G7, because why invest $500 million into a year's presidency, just making the thing work, and then the additional commitments that would come after negotiations. So you're right. People are tired. I see that where I sit now that I've gone from diplomat, bureaucrat to politician. People are tired and they're worried about the bottom line. I sit on our National Finance Committee, and much of the discussion in our Senate is about the fiscal anchor and how all of the money that has gone out is somehow going to be paid back, assuming that global interest rates remain low. The same discussion is taking place in all of the other countries, and I think for the UK, it's a particular challenge for the reasons that you explained. On the other hand, if I can just say something about the UK, I've had the best of working relationships with my counterparts, and I see that Peter Hill, who was the Sherpa for Charlevoix, is also the person who's going to be running COP. And he was front and center in a lot of our civil society engagement. So I take great heart from that. But what you say is very true, because as leaders get closer, other than the host who has to be briefed up constantly and has to give direction, and that's the way it was with Justin Trudeau and myself, The others will be focused on other things, and they will get occasional briefings. And then when they finally sit down for a day and a half, the agenda is actually quite segmented. So a lot of the work has to be done beforehand. And then there could be the events that that take place. Thinking of Harold Macmillan there, but there are unusual events that that can occur, and in G7 history, these we've seen these. It's not just Russia, going way back, and Tristan will know this. Chernobyl and the Chernobyl shelter fund that was established that G7 countries are still paying into. Some of the debt relief in Africa, that from Gleneagles has still formed discussion further on. So you're building on a lot of activity that has taken place. It's almost like law. You know, it's the previous cases, and you build up, and you have this long bit of jurisprudence. So too. You have that in the G7, with the potential, as Tristan has said, that it could go further. It could be inserted more aggressively into the G20 or into institutions. But I think your assertion, Lauren, is fundamentally correct. It's going to be tough.
Great, thanks, Ed. So we have some various questions coming in from participants through the Jamboard, and encourage everyone to make use of that. Peter, coming to you, looking at CSO influence, which Tristan had said has helped sort of make the G7 what it is to a certain extent. In your experience as someone who's being at the receiving end of that work, what sort of things have you set in your mind that stand out of being exemplary examples of the civil society influencing the agenda or helping shape some of the outcomes at a G7 summit? Does anything come to your mind, or are we hopeful that we're having more influence than we're actually impacting beyond opening dialogues and sharing some general policy points?
Well, thanks. A couple things come to mind. I think on climate change, civil society has been very instrumental, and that's one reason why at the last few summits, everybody had a stiffened spine in terms of standing up to the U.S. to the point where, in the communiques, we eventually threw up our hands and said, "You can have your own paragraph as to what you think. The rest of us simply do not agree with you." So that is one. Lauren mentioned this on SRHR. I think over the past several years, that has been quite important. Again, sort of pushing the boundaries as to what the U.S. would accept, and that has been a significant aspect as well. Education too. Health and on Ebola and other potential pandemics, and of course we've got one now. So that has been good, and I think generally on development assistance and looking at new ways and means, sort of incremental progress on that. But also on labor, you know, the tragedy in Rana Plaza a few years ago in Bangladesh, that led to a lot of pressure from labor organizations that kind of went into the ILO and then came back into the G7, and leaders could not ignore that. That gets into global supply chains, trade, and the like. The one word no one has mentioned yet, and I will do this right now, is China. And how to deal with a global giant that is very different from the rest of us in terms of the authoritarian type capitalism that is underway, and the concerns on human rights. And we were very close in 2018 to having an agreement in terms of how we would collaborate in dealing, in engaging with China in terms of investment, in terms of the steel oversupply. We had that all set up, ready to go to leaders at, I think, about our third Sherpa meeting, and then the U.S. decided, or President Trump, better put, decided to put tariffs on all of us instead. Without telling us, and it led to Gary Cohn's resignation and a number of other things, but really tipped us into a different area. But the discussions that have taken place on China for the past several summits, or at least the ones I was at, have been the most fascinating, really, in terms of public policy discussion, and that has been, I think, good. So I veered off a little bit, but we did get on. We don't talk. This group is not talking much about the other part of civil society, but there are business organizations that also speak to leaders, and that is really where the China issue came up as well. I'll stop there.
Thanks for that. And to all the panelists, so a question coming from and building on the China nationalism, we're hearing that, you know, the G7 might be extended or invite, you know, new countries like India, for example. But given that Modi sort of sharply decreased in civic space in India, what sort of message is that putting out if we're going to expand it to democracies in name, but not in actual how they're handling civil society and their wider public space? And throwing that out to the whole the panel.
Well, I think that it is based on certainly what was being discussed last week. It seems very, very likely at this point that India will get an invitation, and what it means for substantive inclusion. I think that the comments that I've seen on the board are to the extent that there's a concern. I think it's a legitimate concern, and my big worry is that this would push what is presently a pretty good, in relative terms, outreach program with respect to civil society. It would push it more towards the G20 civil society outreach, which is well, somewhat less successful, somewhat less substantive. And so I think efforts would need to be put in place to ensure that that would not transform the nature of civil society engagement, and indeed what counts as basically what counts as democracy, what counts as democratic governance. You know, something that something Laura said really resonated with me, that you know, we're probably heading into a period of time where the difficult conversations need to be had again. This is one of them, just in terms of, well, what is a democracy and what counts as a democracy, and you've got you know, I do share the concern basically that others are voicing. I'd be interested to hear what the others think on this.
Lauren, do you want to go? Do you want to respond to that point, or Peter? Okay.
I will.
Okay, great.
There's another form of outreach, and it's taken place at all summits, and I think we all know this, but I think it's worth mentioning, and that is on the last day, other countries, other leaders are invited. So in 2018, because we wanted to have the ocean plastics discussion, we had a number of leaders from countries all over the world with coastlines or from small island states who are particularly vulnerable to climate change and that their country will disappear, for the discussion. So in the past, this has been a way to include others without actually expanding the core membership. Without being too funny, but I'm an originalist on this, and I think that having that group of 7 plus the EU having a good discussion for, let's say, a day and a half, depending on how you do that, and then having an expanded meeting with everyone could be very good. And that was the case. Unfortunately, President Trump had already left for his summit in Singapore with Kim Jong-un, but nonetheless, I think it's a good thing to do.
And so, coming from what you were saying on the formality and how the G7 works and the personal engagement with that, 2 questions from that. One is, do you think the G7 will be impacted if the US does not hold a summit this year? As you know, President Trump had been delaying, and now we have this interim situation between Biden and Trump. Does it, you know, it's unlikely that's going to be any substantial meeting. Do you think that's going to have a long-lasting effect? another question relating to that, if we don't have a physical meeting next year because of COVID, can we build that sort of interrelationship that actually gets the deals done and makes the in-quarter conversations happen? Is that effective? Will we get any sort of outcomes if it's a virtual summit as opposed to a physical summit? Just putting that to you, Peter, from your previous observations.
A virtual summit's certainly a lot cheaper. The only security you have to worry about is cybersecurity, and just assuming that in some capitals of the world, everything you do will be observed. So no, it's not the same. And what I found particularly interesting in my years of being in the rooms where it happened was to just watch the back and forth between leaders, because you can't have a briefing book on your lap if you're there sitting just a few or a meter or two away from someone, which of course distancing now is a different matter. But and it's the cut and thrust in discussion, and invariably leaders come prepared and briefed up and ready to go. And I think in particular of the example of Prime Minister Conte of Italy, who came 2 days or 3 days after he had been sworn in as prime minister, and he was all primed and ready to go. Yet the president of the United States had his own views, and they did not match anything that his Sherpa was putting forward. So there you are.
Thanks. Any other comments from that from the other speakers?
Yeah, I think the virtual aspect is a challenge for advocacy too, not because necessarily many of these groups on this call go there, but a lot of what the public sees of a G7 is their sole understanding is it is the leaders' summit, and they see, cool, great groups doing superhero costumes and, stunts and wearing giant spitting image leader faces. And yes, that's not what most of the people on this call do, unless I've missed something in your work in the last few years. But it is part of reaching the public consciousness. And as we sort of, people have referenced Live Aid, and my sense is that we are coming out of an era where those big glamorous celebrity concerts are as effective an advocacy tactic. They're intended to provide a carrot to government, but you have to set them up so early in advance. You can't just decide. And so you've effectively, as an advocate, offered the carrot, and then there's no stick because you can't cancel the concert or uninvite the leader when they don't step up with what you want them to. And so my sense is that sort of big concert moment was a sort of phenomenon of the early 2000s, 2010s, and that we're starting to see the fade out of that already. And so I think both the virtual element as well as the shifting landscape is a challenge for advocates, and being conscious that what the public sees is that very tiny slice of the physical leaders summit for a few hours, and what they usually see is they don't see any of the work and the policy drafts and the notes and letters. They see great young advocates wearing funny costumes, and then they see people with protest signs, and then they usually see the renegade black bloc in fences. And so, yeah, I think that poses a challenge to us as well.
This is actually a topic that I've been working on for the past 6 months with very little else to do, stuck inside one room. And the physicality of the summit really matters for the reasons that both Lauren and Peter have outlined, both with respect to the public, that the spectacle of the summit has a framing effect, has a sublime effect in governance writ large. This really matters, and you just don't get that on Zoom. We can, thinking of the extraordinary G20 leaders meeting back in late March, nobody much cared. There's something about the spectacle of bringing people together that then the meeting has import, then the meeting has an effect, or at least can have an effect. And this also, I think, but this is definitely more Peter's domain, but I would suggest that this has an effect in the policymaking process within government bureaucracies, in that having a deadline, having a spectacular event at which your leader is going to be present, at which your leader needs something to announce at its conclusion, has an effect in generating the need for negotiation, the need for some sort of big announceable. That pressure is just not there when it's just a Zoom meeting, or at least I would suggest it's not as great.
I think Cal makes a very good point there, and Lauren did earlier as well. So part of the purpose is to show solidarity. You can show solidarity in the famous family photo, which is staged. You can show it in action shots, and I think there are. The Guardian had a very interesting thing about a year or two ago of the famous photo where Angela Merkel seems to be confronting Donald Trump. But if you look at the photo from other leaders' perspectives, they're in it and they're doing the confrontation. And yeah, I mean, even I'm in it, so it's really weird. But where we have sometimes differences is, can we have a document that we all agree to, a communique, which of course is negotiated, which demonstrates this solidarity, or does it get whittled down to such a lowest common denominator that it's worthless, and you, in members of civil society and the media, will say, well, that's absolute garbage. Why spend money on something like that? And that is the challenge that we had in our year. We came up with a communique. I was ready with a back pocket chair's declaration, because I feared that we would not get unanimity on climate change, on Iran, on any number of different issues, and it would just look awful, and it would be an embarrassment for my leader and my country, quite frankly, and me too. So what we tried to achieve was a communique. We got it. And there were some substantive parts in there. It was relatively short, but it was much more difficult for France the following year. And in fact, it didn't work. And so as we passed the torch over to France, I remember going to Paris and meeting in the Élysée with the team. And briefly with the president, I explained that, and here are the issues that you might want to continue with. We attached a lot of importance to them, and so that was done. So it's that continuity, and that particular continuity was interrupted this year. So will the G7 survive going without an American summit? I think so. Will it be different? I think so too. Does that put a lot of pressure and the onus on the host, on Prime Minister Johnson? Absolutely. And this is something where, you might want to celebrate Britain. We all celebrate our own countries, but you have to celebrate the longevity of the G7 as well, for it to continue to be to have influence, if somewhat diminished, as Tristan said in his opening remarks.
Yeah, no, very good point. And it has endured before, and although that's been quite disruptive the last couple of years, especially with President Trump's presidency, it'd be great to see it endure. But that comes around to the issue of two issues really, is looking at accountability. G7's making commitments, and a lot of our work as civil society is to ensure they live up to those commitments. Do you see sort of this, the panel and Peter, but do you see the break for the US, has that broken the accountability process? Can we go back to Glen Eagles and say, you made this commitment and you made commitments around it? Is that still continuing, or do we have to start from scratch, or can we not look back to the 2010 commitments around maternal health, for example? Are we starting from scratch, and if we are starting from scratch, how do we embed accountability into the G7 process that helps us make sure that countries continue to live up to their commitments, and issues have consistency across summits?
If I may start this one. Many of my colleagues over the years have come to me and said, we're trying to discover where the best source is to track accountability. And I tell them every time, or they come to this conclusion themselves. It's at the University of Toronto, the Monk Center, which has been tracking, John Curtin and his team have been tracking G7, G8, G20 accountability for a long, long time. And it's there. So whether you can do this in an empirical way and set aside, you know, the cut and thrust of realpolitik, I think you can to some degree, but it gives you an indicator, not just how the group has performed, but how individual countries have. And having an accountability report at the end on one particular issue, as has been the case since that accountability approach started. And it was, I think, Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper who did that at the Muskoka Summit, unless I'm wrong, but he did. And I was also his Sherpa, not for there, but afterwards. Is I think important. The Americans did not like an accountability report because it would grade them, and other countries had some reservations. But at the end of the day, there was a grudging acceptance of doing that. And of course, then civil society can also hold us to account. And if we have better and broader engagement with civil society, it's that holding to account, and Lauren mentioned that earlier, that could come up in the discussions, in the preliminary discussions that the summit planners would have with civil society organizations.
To jump in, whenever I hear the sort of accountability discussion that we have every year, and we have to have it, and it's a thing, I sometimes find it frustrating because there's often a trend towards looking for a neutral appeal board, as if like a G7 declaration is some sort of legally binding instrument, and like if a government violates it, there's sort of like an ICC you can take it to, or WTO. And and I've even heard on calls folks talking about setting up a kind of some sort of international legally binding mechanism, which I don't actually understand how that would work. But there just isn't. Accountability is hard, and it is messy, and it's part of the advocacy process. Your levers are largely domestic because domestic governments respond to domestic pressures. I don't think there is an overarching international governance structure. There's no appeal board that, when governments don't adhere to vague commitments they made in a communique, that you can go to. You're stuck with the same mechanisms, the advocacy tools, the tactics, the things you do, and the variety of them. And you have a variety of players who have different ethos, brand, tone in the way they advocate. And you sort of hope that collectively you either put on enough pressure from different angles with different targets and pillars and messages and pushes, or that you're able to sort of leverage a soft spot for your government. But yeah, I just, there's no one tool that makes a government accountable. We're now all democracies. And so governments respond to elected populaces, and now we all understand the very basics of sort of civics 101 and Roman style democracy, thanks to Joe Biden's lovely speech. Power comes from people pressure, all of that jazz. And so, yeah, you can have your tools and your accountability reports and your scorecards, but all they are tools for your advocacy to try and hold governments accountable. And so I guess I would try and move us off a conversation about one magic instrument, or that there is some higher power who gets to adjudicate a G7 communique, and put it back into that messy, uncertain, hard advocacy space.
Yes, great. Very good reality check, Lauren. Moving to a sort of a different perspective here, we saw the last couple of years, gender and women have come up the agenda, and now we've had the Gender Advisory Board established and running. Should the G7, or how should the G7 deal with other cultural sort of broad issues, and looking particularly at Black Lives Matters, which has been growing up, and the racial inequality that's been happening? Is that something the G7 should deal with? Is that something they should put on their agenda, to look at that sort of inequality within its member states and within the broader global community? Is that something for their agenda? Just throwing that out there.
Cal, can you help me out and rephrase that? I made the mistake of going into the chat, and I was starting to answer things. So can you please rephrase that?
Don't want to encourage that. No, we're really looking at the cross-cutting issues and the cultural changes that are happening in the world, and especially around Black Lives Matter. We saw the Gender Advisory Council on really tackling inequality amongst the genders. The G7, should it be tackling the same thing amongst races and minorities within the G7 countries and within the broader global community? Do you think that's something that it should head down that direction?
Oh, absolutely. I think so. I tried intersectionality with my Sherpa colleagues, and it didn't work as a concept, or explaining it in terms of our own diversity in Canada, the challenges that we have, Indigenous peoples, minority groups, Black, Brown, and I think we've got a lot more work to do. But I would say there that you have to prepare the terrain, and I find that President-elect Biden's message of healing and his willingness to work with allies is very encouraging on that. And I think governments working with the U.S. government, new U.S. administration, once it's set up, should really try to emphasize those things.
Great. Sorry, Lauren, go ahead.
Yeah, I just was going to say, I also think there's sort of whenever we talk about issues that are predominantly in one country, and particularly the US, understanding that each other country has its own, not version of it, but its own kind of, for Canada, Indigenous peoples, as Peter mentioned, is sort of one of the key preoccupying themes around inequality. I mean, I don't want to, like, France, is currently engaged in a really heated debate around sort of secularism and Islam. So each country has its own form of preoccupying debate around structural inequality, and the ability to allow space for all CSOs and all voices within that isn't dominated by one particular country, which the US tends to, right? It's culturally sort of our bedrock normstone things that yeah, and fully agreed, like the UK decolonialization in the UK, but you could write a thesis on it. That comes from a different perspective. So having a space where each country can bring their own kind of unique debate, touchstone cultural issue to the table, I think is really important, and not to exclude groups, if that was not particularly sort of eloquent, but that was what came to mind.
Just very quickly, I think normatively it's absolutely an issue, a really set of issues for the club, but practically, for a whole host of reasons, I don't see it going very far. And just sort of pragmatically, I mean, yeah, you end up spending a lot of capital and going nowhere.
Okay, thanks for those observations. So final couple of minutes, and just want to pose two questions to the group. And maybe this is posed mainly at Tristan, is that saying the work that you have said on around Glen Eagles, particularly that civil society did to create the outcomes and help build the G7, should we be putting this attention, capacity, resources to the G7, or if we have that influence, do you think, should we apply it to other forms in the global governance structures that will actually achieve more, be more balanced, be more representative, or should we continue focusing on the G7?
Well, I defer to the other people on this entire group, who much better knows how best to spend very limited resources. But I mean, to the extent that I can offer an answer while dodging it slightly, I don't think that giving up on the G7 is a move to make entirely. I still think, just thinking of the G world, I do think that the best bet for moving things forward on issues, on big issues, is still in the 7 rather than the 20, particularly if it's coming from civil society.
Great, excellent. And leading to that, and for the final question is, we've heard a lot about the G7, G20 agendas in 2021. The British government's looking to align, especially around climate, with the Italian presidency of the G20. And people are also looking ahead and very excited by the German-India combination in 2022. So how does G7 and the G20 work better together from a civil society perspective and from government perspective? Peter, is there a natural synergy that, or are they different agendas within those governments and the G7 governments? And from civil society, how do we build those bridges to make sure that we deliver outcomes in 2021 at both summits?
You know, Thomas Carlyle referred to economics as the dismal science, and I want to encourage Tristan to be a little bit more optimistic. I think we can move this needle forward. One has to be optimistic. Okay, so where the G20 is different is if you've got a whole lot of people at the table, meaning not just the leaders of the G20. You have the IFIs there, you have the finance ministers, you have some instances the foreign ministers. So there's a real brace of people, which means that, of course, the speeches tend to be set piece, and preliminary negotiation is a bit more difficult. So where I see the G7 being helpful there is to look at the issues, the two big themes that are out there. It's obviously global health and it's the global economy. And remembering that the G7 was originally formed because of the problems in the global economy perpetuated by the OPEC oil crisis in the 1970s. So it's been around a long time in one form or another. But I think the dialogue that leaders can have, the combinations, Kel, that you mentioned that are occurring in the G20, the one-step, two-step, I think that's important. We saw reversal of dates last year with Japan and France, for example. I think having those preliminary discussions is important. We cannot forget as well that ministers meet fairly consistently. Certainly finance ministers and increasingly health ministers are meeting. We did not have a health ministerial meeting in our year, but I would say these have to now take place on a regular basis. Beneath the waterline, there are any number of different working groups and the like that exist in the G7 that can take issues forward. Some have been around for a long time. Some of them are in the security field. Some are in the economic field. That work should be given more publicity, and hopefully it can come up to leaders, so leaders can set out a rationale as to how they can first have the discussion and then exercise influence, whether it is taking a few themes further into the G20 or into the IFIs and the international organizations, and that is the important thing. The one silver lining in all of this is that leaders are confined to their offices. They're not on the hustings meeting people unless there's an election campaign, and even then it is much more constrained. So they actually have more time to interact with each other. I don't work for Prime Minister Trudeau anymore, but I know he's up early in the morning making calls to foreign leaders and assessing what's going on, and the others are doing the same thing. So whether it's Zoom or any other platform, there's a lot of talk going on, and maybe this should be channeled a little bit as we go further. I'll leave it there.
Any other final comments from the other speakers? Nope. Okay. Well, excellent. Thank you very much, Peter, for taking the time to join us and giving that insight. It's been really helpful and will hopefully set us up for the rest of our strategy meeting, which progresses over the next couple of days.
My absolute pleasure, and if I may, just I know there are a lot of people and participants. I'm sorry I couldn't respond on the chat. Some interesting and provocative comments, but you can reach out to me through my email address if you wish. I admire everything that you are all doing as a collective and individually in your country. So be safe and be well. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you, Tristan, and thank you, Lauren. We'll be seeing you guys later on during the strategy meeting, I'm sure. But Now I want to sort of move over, and we've heard about where the G7 sits in the multilateral system, which has been very really helpful in setting it up. Now let's take a look at the actual presidencies themselves, get a briefing on what the politics and the policies are looking like, a little bit from the US to get an idea of what scenarios we may have in the remainder of the US presidency, and then looking ahead to the UK presidency itself. I'm pleased, and if they can slowly turn their videos on, I'm pleased that Lyric Thompson, who is Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy at the International Center for Research on Women, will be joining us on this panel to give a little outlook on the US. We'll also have Kit Dory, who's Policy Manager at Bond and who's doing all things G7. We'll be giving an overview. Claudia Craig, Senior Government Relations Advisor at UNICEF UK, talking about the work that they're doing on lobbying, engaging the government. And Sophie Dodd, who's CEO of Future Leaders Network and leader of the Y7, will be giving a perspective of some of the how the engagement groups are engaging. So what I want to do is I will hand over to Lyric in a second, but can I just make two housekeeping issues? One is, please use the Jamboard for your questions as much as possible. That's excellent. And also, it looks like the stickies have a word limit. So it's going to be very good for us to learn how to ask very concise questions so they don't overrun, because some of the questions were not quite straightforward because I think they ran out of room. So just a little housekeeping issue on that one. So Lyric, if you're with us, again, we're in panel mode. So if you use your speaker view, you will see the picture of the person who is speaking, and that will help us figure out who's who, because we have 3 pages of videos and we have 71 people involved. So without further ado, just going to hand over to Lyric if you want to take over and share some of your thoughts on the US presidency. Okay. Oh, there we go. Lyric. So sorry about that. So I think Lyric dropped off there for a second, but she just rejoined us. And so Lyric, we're just starting a new panel on the G7 presidencies, and it'd be great if you can give us just a couple quick overview of what you see happening from the US, remainder of the US G7 presidency.
Sure. Well, not much. I think we now know that the President-elect Joe Biden will, thank goodness, hopefully save us from our worst version of ourselves. And so I think the only thing that we were anticipating that there might be a chance of for a US G7 was if Trump won and wanted to throw himself a party and invite Russia and a number of other countries that he had mentioned potentially inviting to join. That happily is no longer a scenario that we need to worry about. And of course, we've seen many of the allies already congratulate President-elect Joe Biden. So I think that while I do not anticipate that President Trump, who still hasn't conceded, will go quietly into that good night, I don't anticipate that there's anything else we need to be worried about on the G7 calendar, with the potential scenario that actually I haven't heard from anybody but you, Kel. I've been asking around, but if it happens, you know, I'm now prepared thanks to my friends in Canada, which is that Biden might ask to borrow a little time from the G7 calendar in January and just say, you know, look, we're sorry we made such a mess of things, we're back. And his, you know, administration is anticipated to be one that is very much interested in rebuilding US engagement in various multilateral fora, including the G7, despite the fact that most people don't know what the G7 is, or if they do, they hate it. That was a campaign commitment he made, that he would use the G7 and G20 to engage on climate in particular. Their transition website is live, and there are 4 priorities that they have articulated generally for their administration, not specifically for the G7, but I think we could anticipate carryover in terms of where the US would like to play ball, and that's obviously coronavirus recovery and response, the economy, which kind of tandem, hand in hand, and then climate and racial justice. So I think most of the conversations that the US has about racial justice, the latter, have been domestic facing, but I think it gives us an opportunity to talk about inequality and, taking an intersectional approach to our foreign relations and foreign affairs and foreign assistance. So potentially some fun things there. Again, I haven't heard that from everyone who is, who I know in a staff position who's been working on this in a career staff position, I should say. Obviously the politicals will leave, have been very buttoned up about there being any plans to do anything like that. I think the bottom line is, I think day one we will see the return to Paris, which we formally exited just last week, as well as repeal of the global gag rule. And so I think those are sort of the areas where we will get immediate traction and an anticipation of where the US would like to go. But I don't see anything happening in the remaining few weeks of this year, certainly. Although but I do think that the US will be eager to be seen as a constructive player at the G7, as well as COP, as well as the Generation Equality Forum. And basically, if anybody's hosting a forum next year, I anticipate the US will want to be there and be seen to be constructive and friendly and progressive.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thanks for the overview. Yes, it's obviously it's a changing tableau every day. So good luck with that and with the transition work that with the new Biden government. So looking ahead at the UK, and again, please do throw questions on the Jamboard as you go along, or some observations, and we'll share those after the panel speak. But just going to hand over to, I think, Kit, you're gonna kick off on just the UK scenario for 2021.
I was going to give some further elaboration on the topics, but actually we were going to start with Claudia on the kind of political context.
Right, I'll kick us off then. And I'm aware that I'm speaking to quite a broad audience. I can see some very familiar names in the chat box, including many that know far more about what I'm just about to speak out than I do. But this will primarily be a kind of update on the UK political context for those of you who are perhaps less familiar with what's going on the UK political scene and kind of what the political setting may look like in 2021. As a lot of you will be aware of, we had an election in December 2019 last year, which saw Boris Johnson's Conservative government win an 80-seat majority. This was viewed as a landslide, and a huge part of this majority was down to the Conservative Party winning what's known as red wall seats, which are seats that are traditionally held by the opposition party, the Labour Party. And we've seen those MPs form a key part of the government's majority and a key part of the kind of influencing sphere within Parliament, alongside Conservative MP grandees and Conservative MPs who've been long supporters of Brexit and are part of the kind of Boris Johnson administration and side of the party. Despite seeing this kind of group of influential backbenchers come in, power within government is still very centralized. The majority of decisions are coming out of number 10. Everything needs to go for sign off through number 10. So backbenchers and the wider parliamentary party don't perhaps have as much influence as they may have had within wider administrations, which obviously makes our jobs within advocacy and campaigning a little bit tougher. In addition, we're seeing the government's domestic handling of the pandemic not going down too well with some of that new intake of Conservative MPs. It's created some regional disparities in the approach that they've taken, and that has led to us seeing quite a few more rebellions than we were perhaps expecting at the start of the year. So I guess just within Parliament, the context is, despite the large majority, not everything is sunshine and rainbows within the Conservative Party. And then moving away from Parliament and towards Whitehall, we've obviously seen the FCDO merger, which happened in June of this year. And for those of you who aren't aware, that was the UK government merging its Department for International Development with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. This was very much pitched as the UK bringing together its development and diplomacy, and the G7 was explicitly stated in the merger announcement to Parliament and in almost every press release since then. as a kind of, key opportunity for the UK to have greater impact and influence on the world stage. So a big part of the merger and of all of this is the UK government kind of continuing to position itself post-Brexit, and as Brexit negotiations are ongoing, as a country that is still ready to lead on the world stage, that still has things to say, that still wants to hold on to its influence and wants to be that kind of global Britain force for good in the world. In terms of the FCDO's priorities, while Cabinet Office is obviously leading a lot of the G7, the new FCDO is a key player. We were expecting those priorities to be defined by the UK government's integrated review, which was kind of pitched as the biggest review of the UK's foreign, defence, security and development policy since the end of the Cold War. However, we've now been waiting on this review for several months, and it does seem to be continually postponed. We were expecting it to coincide with the comprehensive spending review at the end of this year, which the Chancellor would have issued, but that is now being postponed as well. So everything's looking a little bit on hold. We're expecting more clarity at some point in between now and January. Believe it or not, that is the latest update from the government yesterday in Parliament. So that is kind of where we're at with the integrated review. And until we have that, the FCDO's priorities, and therefore the kind of development and diplomacy priorities for the merger, have kind of been filtering through and have been said in various speeches, statements, through civil servants, but we don't have that kind of, this is what the UK government wants to focus on, other than, of course, the Prime Minister's personal commitment to girls' education, and again, really honing in on the climate aspects of it. And I think especially as they try to build bridges with the potential Biden administration, that climate will be a key focus of that for the UK government as well. And then in amongst all of this, as I said, we of course have Brexit ongoing. We're potentially looking again at a no deal towards the end of the year. And in 2021, alongside these big global moments, we will have local elections happening. We will have the Scottish Parliament elections happening. That will be a key test for the kind of Conservative government post the 2019 election, to see how much of an impact some of that perceived mishandling of the COVID-19 pandemic domestically is going to have on their seats and on that red wall. So I guess in terms of where that leaves us for the political context of the G7 in 2021, and as Lyric said, it's not just the G7, it's COP26, it's the PPE replenishment. We're also, while it's not UK hosted, have the Nutrition for Growth Summit and the rescheduled Olympics happening at some point next year. The government is very much, I think, seeing 2021 as a kind of rebirth for this post-Brexit global Britain. They're seeing it as a very significant year for the UK's role on the world stage, similar to the American administration. And we have seen, with the pandemic, that the government has still been keen to demonstrate that the UK is there. They've been really, bigging up their contribution towards CEPI, their hosting of the Global Vaccine Summit earlier this year. A lot of these announcements have very notably come directly from the Prime Minister's office. It is something that they're wanting to really celebrate and push, is, their achievements and contribution on the world stage. But however, as I said earlier, this will be taking place against a backdrop of increasing economic downturn here in the UK, local elections, increased regional disparities, and the government will be under pressure that the kind of expenditure and celebration and perhaps peacocking of the G7 is not perceived to be happening at the expense of domestic investment at the worst, and at best actively benefits UK taxpayers and is in the UK's national interest. So those are the real varying pressures that the UK government will be facing next year, and I'm happy to answer any questions as we move into the discussion. Thank you.
Kit, do you want to say some words, or are we going to Sophie?
No, I'll come in now. So yeah, as I mentioned, kind of say a little bit more about the policy priorities that have been set. But I think it's worth mentioning or emphasizing, as Claudia was saying, that there's so much in play at the moment. There's a lot of going back to first principles when it comes to how aid is going to be spent, how development is done, as part of this integrated review of foreign policy, which hasn't been finalized yet. So we are working in the dark a little bit, and it is quite difficult to assess what those key priorities are. So just to stress that. And also when it comes to the policy priorities, having spoken to a number of different people and through our direct engagement as the C7 lead, we've heard quite a lot of different stories about what the priorities are going to be. And we counted together with the other engagement groups, maybe over 10 so that have been set as priorities, and maybe 5 or 6 that are going to be leading priorities. So clearly that's not the case. And clearly there's going to be a bit more of a focus, but I've heard people convinced on, having heard from different teams, different sets of goals and different objectives. So I think it is worth saying that I'm not going to try and do that myself, and this is heavily uncertain. We're expecting that they are going to announce the final list soon, but that could mean anything. So probably, they said after the US election, but it could be up until January, as Claudia said. So part of the reason why we've heard those different things, generous interpretation, is that we don't know how COVID is going to develop and how the secondary impacts are going to continue. So maybe they're holding off until they know a little bit more about what the major issues are going to be. But there is also that lack of strategy, and a lot that's up for grabs, as I mentioned. And there might also be a certain extent of telling people what they want to hear. I think that's been happening a little bit, sort of, according to their own policy focus. So yeah, that's just kind of the uncertainty there. But in terms of the full list, I think we can identify 6, maybe 6.5 major priorities that have come out through a variety of conversations. So one is girls' education, which has already been mentioned by Claudia. I saw in the chat box as sort of the W7 have been highlighting sort of how that fits into a broader conversation about gender equality, or is more specific to girls' education. It's still up for grabs a little bit, I get the impression. We've also been told food security will be high up on the agenda. So that's of significant interest to particularly the Foreign Secretary, but potentially at the leaders level as well. Food security might be on the agenda. Climate and environment have come up in a number of conversations. As they've termed it, green recovery is also of great interest, in seeing the G7 as a stepping stone to COP, as people have mentioned already. Then fourthly, there's a focus on health systems. So there was Boris Johnson's patented 5-point plan for health recovery and COVID that he announced at the General Assembly, which shows that is very high up the agenda as well. Fifthly, we've been told economic recovery will be very much in the mix, potentially as an overarching theme, but maybe as its own specific area as well. And as a specific area, we've been told that finance might come under that, supply chains or sustainable supply chains, and debt also potentially coming under that as a very, very broad heading under economic recovery. I think this is one of the more interesting ones, because while we might agree on the overall heading being a priority, it certainly will be interpreted differently by government than it would be by us and our membership, and probably the other engagement groups as well. So I think that will be the key area for contest there, is what does that actually mean when they're talking about economic recovery? How much is that back to normal, and how much is that protecting the financial system, for example? And then sixthly, this came in a bit later because it wasn't mentioned by the engagement team that government that we've been working with, but the Foreign Secretary did say in front of a parliamentary committee fairly recently that he wanted to focus a lot on open societies, and he specified that as being about freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and democracy, but also about free trade and removing barriers to trade, probably a kind of neoliberal version of that. So that might also be a kind of bringing together of issues that we might interpret differently as well. So that's a general area under open societies, which is also an area for contest. Then the last one I said 6.5, so the half one is digital. They did say digital was going to be high up on the agenda, but that sort of dropped off fairly recently. I don't know whether there'll be room for that as a specific topic in itself. When it comes to how these conversations are being organized within government structures, so as the C7 lead, we've been mostly talking to the team within the Cabinet Office. So the Cabinet Office, I'm sure most of you know this already, but sitting underneath the Prime Minister and generally responsible for cross-government implementation of cross-government agendas and working across different departments. So there's a fairly well-resourced team within the Cabinet Office that's called the G7 Presidency Task Force. and they've been the one communicating most of what I've shared with you now about government priorities, although some of what I shared with you is taken from speeches at the UN as well. They've been primarily linked to the engagement groups, and they clearly sit underneath the Sherpa. So there's been a couple of meetings directly with the Cabinet Office team, and then 1 or 2 meetings so far with the UK Sherpa with different engagement groups, and then one altogether where all the engagement groups were brought in. There's also a team within the new Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, FCDO, and we haven't had a lot of direct engagement with them yet, but that is coming down the line, and that's clearly sitting underneath the Foreign Secretary and reflecting more of a development and foreign policy focus. Thirdly, there's a team within the what's called the BEIS department, which is Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and that is generally taking forward a lot of work on the COP summit separately. So kind of as part of that, they're going to be looking very much at climate as part of their G7 work, and the COP preparation for COP and vaccines has come up as a topic that they'll be working on as well. So clearly looking at the UK's production of and access to vaccines. And then lastly, there is a team within the Treasury. I'm not too sure actually what their specific priorities are going to be, but you can imagine what they're going to touch on, and probably more on the economic side, and probably debt will come under that as well. So yeah, those are the kind of 4 teams that we're aware of that are working on this, but all coordinated by the Cabinet Office team, which I've already mentioned. And I suppose when it is worth raising as well, this is already mentioned, that the UK's engagement on the G7 and other summits and other policy areas as well is being a lot more centralized than it might have been in the past. So there's less commitment, I think, in terms of how their practice in engaging with civil society. So although we've had some good conversations and some engagement with officials on the G7, I think as a general rule, this is being a lot more centralized. So it might be for those who are engaged on the UK G7 last time, I wasn't, but if you were, I get the impression that it is going to be quite different in terms of civil society engagement than it was before. So that's something to be aware of. For NGO planning, I mean, we're obviously engaging our members and beyond our membership as well to develop our specific priorities for the summit, and we're really keen to be part of the conversations going on over the next few days to help shape those. We sort of have a kickoff meeting in a couple of days to think through what our C7 priorities are going to be, responding to the government's priorities. But as the different engagement groups are coordinating with the Labour 7, the Women's 7, etc., we have started meeting once a month to make sure that we're sharing information and coordinating with each other. To counteract some of what I mentioned before about being told different things, we have preparation for the Civil Society Summit, and there's a Women's Summit and a couple of other summits that might be planned by government coming up. But again, we can talk about that at a later point. But so far, that's been the basis of a lot of our discussion with the Cabinet Office, has been organising these summits and how they're going to be organised, how open that's going to be. These are a number of questions that we're still grappling with, and still there's a bit of uncertainty about how genuinely open those sessions are going to be. So how do we work around that and engage our membership to not just rely on those as the only way to get our point across? So again, talking tactics, that would be an interesting discussion to have with you all.
Great. Sorry, get my mute button. And we will be coming back. So this is just to reiterate, today's meeting on the 10th is politics and power and policies, and then on the 19th we'll all be coming back together in plenary, and that's where we're talking about campaigns, civil society engagement, C7, and timelines, and sort of the planning and action is going to happen on the 19th. So, but I'll come back to that later. So, Sophie, lovely to have you here, and great to hear your perspective.
Sure, thanks. So Kit, thanks so much for setting out the main framework of the actors and the ways in which we can engage with government. I'm CEO of the Future Leaders Network, which is the organisation that supports and selects young leaders to represent the UK at the Y7. And we've been appointed to lead on the development of the Youth Summit for the G7 2021. I guess what I wanted to do first of all was just to bring to life that framework a little bit for you. So the team in the Cabinet Office that has that works on G7, G20 year in, year out, has kind of morphed into what Kit has described, which is the G7 task force for 2021. But they had really been thinking about the G7 and their presidency for quite a long time. So they held an original kind of kickoff meeting with all of the engagement groups right back at the end of 2019, if you can believe it, which we were all very surprised by and very excited by. It really signaled to us that they were willing to engage with the engagement groups early on. And I think we had a subsequent meeting probably just early 2020 where we started talking about the priorities and the ambitions for their presidency in 2021. Clearly, all the best laid plans were thrown out of the window when COVID hit, and actually it was quite clear that the G7 task force team, or the G7 team at the time, had all been diverted onto COVID, and there really wasn't much scope within government to be thinking much about their presidency. And in light of the fact that the G7 in 2020 was taking a somewhat extraordinary turn of events, with its date being moved and shifted and no clear policy themes, I think there was a kind of a retraction, a withdrawal away from kind of engaging heavily in that in terms of our perspective. That said, I think they started to come back and reprioritize their efforts at the start of the summer, and that was the point at which Kit and I and several other of the engagement groups had a joint meeting with the Sherpa, at which they were quite honest about the fact that they were still in their early stages of thinking, which makes a lot of sense, and very much talking about how they had an idea of some of the priorities, but were waiting upon approval from the Prime Minister. I suspect that they were expecting that COVID would sort of fade away and that we might be over the hump of the worst come September, October time, but clearly that hasn't been the case. And so what I think you've seen is that decisions that they had expected to have made around policy priorities or kind of tracks, that type of stuff, some of the kind of nuts and bolts of running a summit just haven't been made by virtue of the fact that people have been thinking else, and as a result they've still been in very much early stages of discussion. I would argue that the Sherpa has been very, very open. It's been a real pleasure to work with him. He's met with all of the engagement groups, and in fact has met with the 2020 Y7 and Y20 delegations, which is quite unusual for us. So we've normally had to fight to secure time with the Sherpa in the past. I'm not sure whether that's because he has not such a traditional background. So he's a Treasury official by training, not a kind of born and bred diplomat, which means that I suspect he's quite open to engagement, particularly at these early stages, to hearing about different perspectives and policy priorities. And that's been a really positive relationship. I think he's particularly interested in the youth angle as a new father himself. So I think he's really feeling, the burden of the role combined with his personal circumstances, which is always nice to hear and always nice to have kind of an open door in terms of that relationship there. I think in terms of where we are right now, the structure is probably still a little bit unclear. So I suspect that they will be kind of bringing us all back together again fairly shortly to do all of the kind of the further detail. But I would have expected that we would probably have been a bit further than we are now, but that's the way things are with the pandemic, in terms of making final arrangements for all of the engagement groups and kind of sequencing them and setting them up for 2021. And I think, it's really interesting in terms of how the G7 sits across government and the machinery of government that it has enabled and how that's different. So we've had a lot of conversations here today about COP26 and how many of the officials we speak to are really seeing the G7 as a key staging point into COP26. And I think it's really interesting to look at the different machineries of government that each of those two events have enabled. So by way of example, in terms of youth engagement, I have one direct counterpart in the Cabinet Office team for the G7 who has youth as well as a number of other things in his portfolio, whereas in the COP26 they have a bespoke youth engagement team who regularly engages with stakeholders, proactively pushing out ideas, ways to engage and that type of stuff. So I think it really is quite different depending on what the summit is and the way in which you can engage. And the second is that I guess the structure of government is a really important factor here. So we've talked about the FCDO merger, making it slightly more tricky to find the most appropriate minister to encounter. In the youth sector, we don't have a minister for youth. So in previous years, For example, Canada was an excellent example where Justin Trudeau paid real attention to the Youth Summit. In this year, it's not so clear where our kind of major engagement point will be or touch point will be. And we're still trying to work that through. Though I guess one thing we could hope for is a bit of stability next year, having had our election back in 2019. I had a conversation with the Cabinet Office last week, and we talked a little bit then about aspirations. So for us as the youth engagement group, we are really aiming high. We want this to be an exemplar in youth participation in decision making. That's because, you know, we think the G7 is an important international stage, and we think the youth voice is important to be heard at that place. And when we shared that aspiration with the Cabinet Office, they echoed that they wanted all of their engagement groups to be exemplars and best in class, which I think is really interesting, but that is tempered with, I guess, a bit of learning from previous years. So when we talk about what that means and what that looks like, it doesn't mean hundreds of meetings and lots of kind of fanfare and, you know, thousands of engagement events. And, you know, I've heard them talk a few times about France and how that was lots of show, but actually they struggled to see how that translated into substance in terms of the policy recommendations. For example, I know that the youth recommendations and recommendations in their communique, I think they found that quite tricky. So I think there's a real urge to go towards more bespoke, more tailored, more kind of smaller groups in terms of engagement, understand the kind of the mood music of the sector and the best policy recommendations to take forward. And they're also asking us to be quite specific. So whilst they recognise that we will want to have a say on everything, particularly from the youth perspective, they're asking us to, you know, pick a few themes that we think we really want the youth voice involved at, and they will help facilitate that. There's a kind of perspective in terms of being very targeted in their engagement and not just doing lots of things for the sake of it, which I think is quite an interesting angle. I suppose the final element for me to share here is, you know, having had lots of those conversations across all of the different engagement groups, we really have seen that there are a number of themes that keep cropping up time and time again. Climate change, really important, you know, economic recovery, really important, and to some extent, you know, digital and inclusion as part of that have all come up across the groups. And I know there's a real sense that all of the engagement groups in, like, above and beyond the sessions that we have had with the Cabinet Office are meeting on a regular basis, so that we can all ensure that we're all pulling in the same direction where it's relevant. It's natural for different engagement groups to focus on different things. We understand that, but I think in the areas that we can collaborate, we really are doing so. So it's a pleasure to be here, to hear that civil society is doing very much the same, and I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And that was a fantastic overview of some of the political challenges that you guys are facing, as well as how the government is reaching out and engaging for their very, you know, critical year. And we appreciate this is very early in the process. November is before you'll take over the presidency in January. So things are in process and being built. So we want to go to questions and answers. Because we like the strategy meeting to be participatory, we're going to try to do videos. And if you can have a question, you want to raise your hand in the chat, and I will work our way through that. And so if someone asks a question, I will ask then the second person on the list if they could turn the video on, and we can have those questions in a bit more of a dialogue. To kick off, though, a couple of questions come on the Jamboard is, you know, we heard in the previous session how Gleneagles was very effective because the close relationship between the UK government and civil society in building some shared objectives and goals around aid and what have you. With the Johnson government, do we see that happening, or do you expect that to be very much arm's length through the engagement groups? Leave us alone for our agenda, we'll have our goals, and we're not going to have that sort of closer relationship that has happened in previous UK summits. Any ideas on that from the panel? And for those who want to speak, raise your hand and ask a question. Anyone want to take that from the panel?
I would defer to Kit and Sophie on answering that question.
Oh, wow.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, Kit, go ahead.
I think based on what's been said about the personality of the Sherpa, I was just going to say that probably there is going to be a level of engagement, and there probably will be some. You know, they seemed quite keen on the idea of that we suggested at one point about having roundtables with ministers, for example, but that's just on their side, on the official side, saying that's something that they would be happy to push for. I think as a question around the political side, how much that's going to fly, but we're still hoping, we're not giving up, we're still going to hope for good civil society engagement, and we still think we can get that up the agenda. It helps that we have this semi-official structure through the different engagement groups, but just to say that it might be more challenging given the general centralization of decision making that's going on at the moment.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, I guess, you know, as ever, as engagement groups, I think we should be optimistic about that, and I think we should be taking the positive mood music where it comes. I suspect the vast majority of those discussions with ministers will be asked to be quite refined and quite targeted. So these kind of broader, kind of lofty ambitions, kind of, you know, high aspirations type thing are probably going to be reined in for more targeted conversations about specific policy recommendations, or specific ways in which we can further either UK or UK interests internationally. I have reasons to be positive. I think, as kind of Claudia had mentioned, this is a really important stage internationally for the UK next year. And so I have reasons to be optimistic that they will want to do some of the engagement and those meetings. But as Kit's very kindly mentioned, it's difficult to discern at the minute the difference between official level optimism and ministerial appetite for it.
Okay, great, thanks. So we're going to go to some questions now. The chap who you don't have a name in your box, you introduce yourself when you ask the question, but you had the landscape, the dramatic landscape behind you.
Okay, my name is Mosharraf Hussain. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I work with Action on Disability and Development. So I'm in touch with the leadership team of FCDO, and they assured that disability issue will not get less importance than it was before. Before, the UK government was committed, and they said disability will be at the heart of what they do. So I think because of the COVID, disabled people are disproportionately affected, and they are also there is also secondary effect of COVID economic recession on people with disabilities. So I think my question that is, how this issue, because we are on 7 billion in the world, and 80% live in the developing country. So I think how this issue can be taken forward in the summit, and as a cross-cutting issue, because there is a intersectionality of disability and other issues of marginalizations. So I think how we can take this agenda from this group so that it can be reflected in the communique and the final outcome of the document. So a long way we have to go, but I think we should push forward from now. Thank you.
Does anybody want to respond to that question, or do you want to take a couple more questions for the statement?
I just want to say from our side, I completely agree with Mosharraf. This is something that we should be, that we will be and should be pushing for through. I think what we've been talking about so far is what has come up in meetings and what's been mentioned by officials, but I think, you know, that shouldn't be I think there was a really interesting discussion in the chat box about what's on the agenda versus what should be the horizon of what we're asking for and what we should be talking about. So just to say, I completely agree, and not to be limited by what's come up in meetings so far, I guess, necessarily.
Thanks.
Great. So handing over to you, Marwan. I have the list. It's Marwan and Alden, and we have a posted question. So over to you, Marwan.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for bringing us together. Good to be back with you guys. Many faces I remember, and many new faces like every year. This is good. Just a sarcastic comment. I mean, thinking that somehow civil society helped make the G7 and give it some physicality is an awesome thought, and some of my more lefty friends will probably shudder at that. And I think that's the one that made me smile, though I totally, I see the wisdom in that, and maybe that really was one of those moments in Gleneagles that had actually helped build the visibility if not reputation, that I think is still in the woods, but the visibility. But I'm not yet willing to let go of what could be coming from the US as long as they do the hosting without being the host. So again, my question to my American friend, US American, sorry about that, my US American friends, whether they would like to venture. I mean, I'm coming to back, also coming back to what I said in the chat and what Peter, I was too late. You know, the US has already changed how the G7 will be seen from here. I still remember Lauren's excellent talk in Lyon when she pointed out, look at the commitment report and how often, I think I counted 9 times, that the US had pulled out of previously made commitments dating as far back as Elmau. I haven't had yet a good response of how this is going to be affecting future commitments. That's the one. And then also whether there isn't scope for US making some form of G7 statement while Donald Trump is still president. I mean, you know, this is just too quiet on that front for me. I'm a little bit scared. Sorry if I'm the only one, and I am the silver surfer who is too paranoid. Thanks for your views on that.
Thanks for the question. And I also want to just also acknowledge and invite any of my colleagues who are on the call, who have been watching US G7 behavior for longer than I have, for sure. So I see Daisy and John and others, if they want to pipe in on this. I share all of your concerns and am kind of becoming something of a wet blanket here for not being celebrating enough, because I don't think we've heard the last of him. But on the G7 specific question, yes, completely agree that it's problematic that the US under this administration pulled out of pre-existing commitments that were made by the Obama administration starting from year 1. And while the good news is in President-elect Biden, who is someone who values multilateralism, fashions himself very much a foreign relations aficionado, and has deep history in the Senate in those areas and deep relationships with these allies, and I think will be very much in a posture of returning to the table. I think it's going to take a lot of work, and we'll need your help as well, getting our arms around all of the things that the US left, disrupted, blew up, you know, generally harumphed under the last the current administration, and basically plot that all out for incoming leadership and say, here are all the things we'd like you to go back to. I think that will be a very willing ear, a very willing audience to say, yes, thank you for the help. Thank you for giving us the whole mapping of all the things that we need to go back and formally say, you know, we're back on board. They're starting that process now, but I don't think that it's necessarily leading with G7 agreements. I think it's, you know, all of the terrible executive orders, all of the big things like the global gag rule, et cetera. And I think there's really some potential that our pieces that we care about as part of the G7 history get overlooked in that process. So I think that will be a good sort of marching orders for us as we're starting to have our initial meetings with whoever it is on the transition team that's going to be handling this portfolio, you know, to say, here are all the things that we need to go back to, and, you know, maybe make some sort of special statement about that, like, here are some illustrative examples, and then just sort of say something that's like, we're back for all of it. We want to, you know, be good partners. However, I do think, to your point about the US having like broken some template, of multilateral cooperation and showing the world that that this is a bad precedent, that someone else, US or any other country, could come back and say, all right, well, we now are saying we don't agree retroactively to anything the previous administration does. And I think just for the US context, that seems to be where we're headed. It was, you know, half of the country is very unhappy about what just happened. And so I think we're kidding ourselves if we think we're not going to have to do this whiplash pendulum swing every 4 to 8 years, where our values and priorities and the whole agenda changes dramatically. So that we are exploring in other conversations. What role can we use the Congress to do some sort of checks and balances and demonstrate a sense, or through appropriations, that these are priorities that need to sort of endure? What can we build in? But I think your concerns are the right ones, and I share them. And it's a good reminder, thank you, of all of the pieces of various past G7 agreements that the US had said that no longer applied to them, that we can add to our kind of transition talking points on this side of the pond. So thanks for that.
Thanks for that. I'm going to take 2 questions now, because we have more questions. I want to get to them in the time remaining. So I'm going to ask Alden first and go to Elizabeth afterwards. So Alden, take your question.
Yeah, thanks, Cal. Let me build on some of the previous points, what we know and we don't know about Biden. First of all, as people put in the chat, he will scrupulously observe the one president at a time role. He will not do anything to try to upstage Trump before January 20th, appearing at meetings or summits. There may be surrogates or proxies. For example, around the December 12th, 5th anniversary of Paris, which is shaping up to be a pretty big moment with possible announcements from the EU and China on raising ambition. We've encouraged the organizers of that, UK, Italy, France, others, to reach out to people like Speaker Pelosi, who was in Madrid at the COP and hosted the G7 parliamentarians meeting in September with a major focus on the economic and environmental impacts of climate change. She could be a perfect representative for the US at that event, or some of the subnational leaders like Governors Inslee or Newsom, or some of the business leaders. So there will be people from Biden world that I think will be prominent in the next 2 months, but not Biden himself or anyone formally associated with his team, and certainly not anyone that he tips for White House senior positions or cabinet officers. When it comes to engagement after January 20th, starting on January 20th, we already know the outlines of that. He's going to re-enter Paris on day 1. He's going to rejoin the WHO on day 1. He's going to try to restart the Iran nuclear deal. He's going to have a coming back out to NATO kind of party and rebuilding alliances. It's pretty clear, and his major focus, both domestically and I think internationally, will be recovering from the public health and economic impacts of the pandemic. That will be his centerpiece legislative proposal within 10 days of taking office to the Congress, a major Building Back Better strategy. And I think that informs where he will be starting to project out into the international landscape. So as I said in the chat, I think he would be less likely to want to make a major first appearance within the context of the G7 and more likely to do it within the context of the G20, where the coronavirus, the finance minister's Building Back Better action plan, some of the other issues are on the agenda. Others have mentioned the dynamic with China. I just want to make sure everyone understands the US tactics will change under Biden vis-a-vis China, but the aims and goals will not. It will still be US policy to try to constrain China's intellectual property theft, its state subsidies for technologies, obviously a little sharper edge around the human rights abuses in Hong Kong, the Uyghurs, and elsewhere, South China Sea. Those strategic objectives are sort of evergreen in US policy. They don't shift between administrations. What will change is Trump's crazy strategy of alienating all the allies first before standing up to China. And I think China is actually quite concerned about this. They realize that Biden's going to be much more effective in building cohesive strategies with Europe, with Japan, with others in Asia to push back on China on these. And that's going to vastly complicate our work next year, not just on G20, but I think spilling over to the G10, G7 or the D10 as well. I mean, one of the obvious impetuses for expanding the G7 to include those 3 Asian countries, India, South Korea, and Australia, is to strengthen the constraints against China. And China knows that. And so China is not happy about this idea of expanding the G7 to become the D10. So I think we have to take that into consideration. There's some areas where the US and China may be able to cooperate. We're hoping that climate change and energy could be one of them. There may be a few others, but this is going to be a very contentious relationship. So I think the question for the panelists and for all of us, and the question I put in the chat for the first panel, is we need to look at the G7 not as a one-off process, but in the context of all these other processes. It's not just the G20 next year, but there's going to be a global health summit chaired by the EU and Italy. There's going to be the biodiversity summit hosted by China. There's going to be a number of finance summits. There's going to be the Petersburg Dialogue, which will be Chancellor Merkel's going away party. And I've suggested the Germans, maybe they try to get Biden to attend that as co-chairing that on climate and raising climate ambition. There probably will be summits around building back better. And that may be what Biden decides he wants to use as his centerpiece. He said he would host a leaders summit on climate ambition in the first 100 days in office, but he will not have the goods to deliver in terms of increased US ambition domestically or increased US climate finance. So I think he may focus rather on building back better, making sure we use investments to recover from COVID to decarbonize the global economy, where hopefully he will have some accomplishments in his first month in office with this bill in Congress. That could be the focus of his real international coming out party. So I think we need to look at this, with the UK, with Italy hosting the G7, the G20, and them co-hosting the COP in Glasgow. It's almost a perfect synergy to have an integrated strategy. And I guess my question for the panel would be, how much is the UK sort of living into that and thinking more holistically in its strategy and agenda for the G7?
Excellent, thank you, Alden. And just turning to Elizabeth, do you want to make an intervention or a question?
Yes, please. Thanks, Cal. Thanks a lot. Nice to meet everyone. My question is really relating to more of the specifics. When Kit talked about the different priorities of the British government that have emerged from those discussions so far, food security was there. I don't know to what extent the priorities were in order of importance, but in terms of food security, what we're seeing, of course, in the UK right now is a huge focus on food poverty, and all of the campaigning that Marcus Rashford, the young footballer, has done extraordinary in turning the government positions around, particularly on school meals. He's done that twice now, once over the summer, where the government had to basically recommit to providing school meals over the summer, and 2 days ago. And so my question is really, what has come out so far from the discussions with the Sherpa and the Cabinet Office and so on around food security, a little bit more detail on that. And do you think that those discussions around food security are likely to be very much domestic? And how much appetite is there for the question of food security in developing countries? Thank you.
Thanks. Over to the panel on those questions. Does anyone want to tackle Alden's on continuity and how the UK is looking at the G7 in the context of all the events in 2021 and how British civil society is responding to that? And then Elizabeth's focus on how they're dealing with this particular issue around food security.
So I'm happy to come in on the first point around the kind of connection between the G7 and COP26, although I'm kind of afraid to say that I'm not sure I can give you much of an answer about what that looks like. I would definitely say they're thinking about it in the holistic sense. I would absolutely say that they are viewing the G7, the G20 even, and COP26 in a kind of sequential path, although not all lines flow in one direction. So for example, the UK hosts the G7, Italy hosts the G20, and COP26 is hosted jointly by the UK and Italy. So it's quite a fortuitous year in terms of that. I know there has been a lot of consideration about how each of those events link to the other, and I suspect particularly, for example, with regards to climate, they will be thinking about what they announce at the G7 versus what they hold back for COP26, or what agreements it's useful or has great utility value in terms of agreeing at the G7, paving the way for kind of further agreement at COP26. So I would definitely argue they are thinking about that. At this stage, I would say what that looks like in terms of the structures they're putting in place to ensure that there's that continuity, it's not transparent to me at present, but from our conversations, that's definitely happening.
Okay, thanks for that. On a specific question, I think, Elizabeth, when the workshops happen, the working groups, that's when we can have those detailed discussions. I know Callum, who is the chair of the Food Security and Nutrition and Agriculture Working Group, is online. But let's go into the other questions now in the broader perspective of the G7 and ask.
I could come in very quickly on the food security.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, basically, I don't have anything to add in terms of I think Sophie summed it up really well with the how things are going to be integrated. But on food security, I think it's safe to say that it won't be about the domestic situation. I think that's, at least from the point of view of government, because they've recently had to go into a U-turn on that particular issue about supporting school meals during the holidays. So I completely agree with you. It's important to think about these things holistically. I think the government's going to be more interested in how much of a global player it is, and maybe more of a development framing around that particular issue. I think it would be interesting to talk about how we can challenge that as much as possible. But when we had a meeting with them talking about priorities with the Cabinet Office team, they did ask that as an open question, actually, how much should we be looking at hunger and nutrition in the way that it's been dealt with in previous summits versus looking at food systems and the kind of whole framework around supply chains, around production and sustainability and those kinds of bigger questions. And we had a really interesting discussion around that, and I don't think they landed anywhere in particular, but they are thinking about different ways to approach the topic.
Great.
Thank you very much.
So I realize we're at time, but I do want to push this. So I think we've got some questions going. I just want to extend this panel, if that's okay, for a couple more minutes, just to get in some more questions. I can take two questions from Kathy, and then followed by Ross Bailey. So Kathy, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, thanks for the opportunity. I was just wondering how what your thoughts are about the Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion. I know they're a little bit quiet right now, but I imagine they will be ramping up, especially in the spring, and especially as we get a vaccine on board. So I just would love to hear some of your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Shall I take this question?
Well, let's go to Ross first. We'll go to Ross, and then we'll do them all together.
Yeah, hi panel and hi to all attendees. I'm Ross Bailey from Malaria No More UK. I just wanted to ask a quick question about the issue of health and how it's being sort of understood or packaged. I can imagine it's going to be a sort of fairly high profile element of any G7 next year if it does make it through as a thematic area. And just for those who've been interacting with the Sherpa so far and the wider team, is it being seen through a sort of more narrow lens of being able to get announceables about how this is making the G7 countries safer, so that the next COVID-19 won't wash up on our shores? Or is there room and space here to have a sort of more a stronger debate or discussion about improving true health security, so things like expansion of universal health coverage or investment in community health workers? And I only sort of posit one out there because obviously there are many NGOs working on the issue of global health, and where there are things in which we can combine around, it can make for more effective combined advocacy. Thank you.
Hal, do you want to respond to those two questions?
Sorry, was that to me?
Yeah, you were going to jump in there.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I missed my name. So I can definitely answer the first question. In terms of kind of Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion, I mean, they certainly did a great job at kind of raising politicians and kind of the political sphere's awareness of young people's active interest in climate. In terms of the kind of the grassroots movements and what influence they will have on the G7, I think it's hard for me to be particularly specific at this stage. But I would say they probably will have the vast majority of their input through COP26, which has a huge youth engagement arm and which will have several staging posts in the interim. So in a couple of weeks' time, the National Union for Students is running a mock COP, which I guess is it kind of does what it says on the tin. And there will be a virtual conference of youth, which will be hosted by the international community in kind of early next year, I would expect. All of which are intended to be focal points for grassroots youth organisations focused on climate change to have a chance to have their say about what they want to see discussed at COP26 and their kind of ambitions for the kind of final announceables plus agreements. That is hopefully all quite nicely timed, and we're very nicely tied in with YOUNGO, which is the UN organisation that supports the UNFCCC, in terms of bringing the and using them as a prompt for the Y7, which take place in kind of May-ish next year, and then onwards to influence the G7. So I think there will definitely be route ways in, but at the minute I wouldn't be able to say there's a kind of specific way for those two individual grassroots organisations to feed into the G7, though there are definitely ways in which lots of grassroots organisations can feed into both COP26 and the G7 itself.
Add that Extinction Rebellion in particular, I think politically are not the UK government's favourite lobbying group in terms of, you know, if the questions about how would we see them having influence on the G7 and therefore influence on the UK government, they are not Conservative MPs and not Conservative ministers' favourite group, to the point of, you know, mockery on social media and that sort of thing. So unfortunately, or depending on how you look at it, they do not have the ear of the government on that issue. And I think examples like Sophie was giving through Fridays for Future and other, you know, great youth voice initiatives have been much more influential on the governments than Extinction Rebellion.
And then we want to address the Ross's point on the broad spectrum of global health.
On global health, Ross and I are probably in a lot of the same meetings, but I've seen that Katie Husselby is in the call, and I don't know if she is the kind of ultimate UK government and global health spokesperson. Would potentially like to answer that, if you're okay with me putting you on the spot, Katie.
Thanks, Claudia. No problem. We've had some initial discussions, but with FCDO colleagues, Ross, as opposed to Cabinet Office. And I don't know if Kit's discussions with Cabinet Office have kind of got into the specifics of the health framing. I think the steer from FCDO colleagues has been that it's still quite vague at this point. So there's opportunities to influence that 5-point global health security plan that Jenny popped in the chat box earlier. But certainly at this stage, and in terms of the framing that he gave it at the UN General Assembly when he made that speech, it was more of a slightly narrow lens on global health security. So yeah, sorry, a bit of a mixed answer, right? But I guess, you know, at the minute a bit of a narrow lens, but hopefully with an opportunity to sort of broaden that out.
I think again, yes, as we're continuing to see kind of slightly disjointed priorities come out of the FCDO when they're saying one thing is their priority one week and then a speech the next month they're saying it's the other. Obviously, we saw that achieving universal health coverage was mentioned as Rab's kind of #1 priority in his speech to, I think it was the finance minister's meeting, yet haven't really seen UHC mentioned in other parts of the FCDO's work publicly, or at least definitely not coming from Rab. So I think I'm hopeful, Ross, but I think it's definitely much all for us to play for in the UK health sector.
Any comments on that? So I just want to end with just one, sorry, go ahead, Kit.
I just wanted to say, you know, our conversations with Cabinet Office to answer Katie's question have not been more specific. And I think the thing about some of the officials in the team is that they're not necessarily focused on one area, I suppose, the officials that we've been speaking to. So maybe they didn't necessarily have the answers to our follow-up questions, but that might also reflect just that it hasn't been decided yet. So it's interesting to hear that it is still to play for in the FCDO's eyes as well.
Kel, it's Alden, just to come in on this, because I think it underscores my point about G7, G20. I think the UK may defer to Italy on the health issue, since Italy has already announced it's going to be co-hosting with the EU this Global Health Leaders Summit sometime in the spring in advance of the G7 summit. So what I would assume that the UK would let Italy take the lead on that and then have the G7 focus on implementation and getting behind whatever Italy delivers out of that Global Health Leaders Summit. This is from coming from someone that doesn't work intensively on health issues, but just what I picked up talking to people in Europe. The broader point, though, I think around cooperation goes well beyond climate, where I think there is an integrated strategy between the UK and Italy and others around the climate agenda. But it's less clear on other issues such as the debt crisis, the fiscal crisis that developing countries are facing because of commodity price collapse and tourism and COVID-19. I've heard, for example, the Germans are floating this idea of creating a grand commission starting in the G7, but then broadening out to the G20 to look at debt relief, multilateral development bank reform, economic governance, Bretton Woods 2, et cetera, and then trying to recruit China and other major developing countries in to help lead that, which would obviously be a pretty important issue, but also one fraught with a lot of difficulties, given China's current stance on debt relief towards its debtor countries. So I think we just need to look beyond the climate issue when we're looking at G7, G20, because obviously economic recovery, fiscal stability is going to be job one for every leader over the next year. Climate's part of that, but it goes well beyond climate to food security, debt crisis, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay. Thanks for that point, Alden. And it's interesting, it goes back to our conversion between G7 and G20 discussions we've been having. One last question, because we're well over time, but given the issue of vaccines and given the issue of COVID-19 and a lot of these issues, do we see the UK government having conversations with developing countries, reaching out to civil society in developing countries? It's been done in different ways in the past. Is that, do you think, is anyone hearing that agenda? Really short answers just for that point. Thanks.
Probably not. I really, yeah. I mean, they may well be, and probably not on the G7 priorities specifically. I don't know how good their engagement is in terms of reaching out beyond UK civil society. I expect not great.
Okay. Yeah.
But I don't know for sure.
Well, and that's our job as the Global Task Force, to emphasize that the G7 is not just one country, but it's 7 countries, well 8 if you include the EU, and that's our work. So we want to end there. We run over time, but really interesting panel, really effective, great context, setting us up for our next discussion when we come back after the break, looking at the policy discussion, convergence around G7, G20, convergence amongst all these sort of big issues that we're looking at. That really to help put the context, give us an idea of ambitions and the political context that the UK government is going to be dealing with and how you guys as civil society are engaging with them. Thank you to Claudia, Sophia, Kit, and Lyric. Really appreciate that. So everybody, what's going to happen? We're going to take a 15-minute break. Want you back at 5 minutes to the hour. We're going to start the presentation with Eddie Perez, going to give us an overview of how we're going to run the next session, looking at policy, and some breakout rooms can be much more interactive, engaging. So thanks everyone. Take a 15-minute break. See you at 5 minutes to the hour.
So I guess there's a question here before going into the policy about the value of the G7. And so what kind of value shall the G7 have in 2021? And so there, I think we look into the process, and as it was mentioned before by folks, the G7 process is not the UN. It is a very flexible process that depends particularly first on the ability of its presidency to set an agenda that could be agreed upon other leaders. And so based on that, whatever happens within the G7 context in terms of policy, it really depends on the ability to have a consensual understanding on the G7's ability to respond to something, and at the same time to do it in a way where they all feel confident that they can achieve whatever they committed to do. So, you know, we got to think about the flexibility of the G7 as an institution that is not necessarily the UN, and also the G7 as a milestone. So taking into consideration that you know, the G7 takes place along other events, moments, and so that brings us to another element of it, which is the political context of the G7 and what is it that is responding to. So as Alden mentioned earlier today, I think it's important to also recognize that the G7 should not be looked in silos. There are particularly policy elements where the G7 could perform better than other platforms, and you know, that, like the G20. And it's also fair to say that the G7 in itself, because of its institutional capacity, and because these 7 countries are considered as like-minded, there are things that G7 leaders can speak that G20 leaders cannot. So, for example, the G7 communique would be open to discussing transgender rights, but this is not something that the G20 would be open to because, you know, for very obvious reasons, or, you know, the right of the press, or, you know, the G7, it's much more responsive to those like-minded interests and to liberal values than other platforms. So when we look at the continuity of the G7 for 2021, I think the best way to start is also looking backwards. So what is it that the G7 has been able to accomplish in the past? Because that's where the UK presidency is going to build upon. Those things that countries have already agreed on that could help the UK presidency build an agenda that really creates a link between future priorities and those priorities that have already been standing issues in past G7 presidencies. So as we look to policy, based on those early comments that I've made, some key elements that all G7 presidencies think of are the legacy. So what is the legacy of the G7 in 2021? What is the headline? How is it that is going to be perceived in next year, but also in 2-3 years? What is the institutional reinforcement that the G7 is going to bring in response to other platforms? So how the agenda of the G7 will also join the agenda of the G20, the agenda of the UNFCCC, the agenda of the UN Security Council, and so on. How is the G7 responding to global threats and global expectations? And this is particularly important because of the COVID-19, but also because of other global risks that the G7 could engage upon outside of the G7. And so the G7 could serve as a platform to reinforce things that are happening on the outside. And we cannot forget also the fourth element of this discussion, which is the stability of markets. So, you know, the main reason why the G7 or the G20 come together is because they are economies and they want to make sure that there's a stability in markets. So when we look at market stability, you know, if at any point they include a reference on climate change, that might be perceived as a huge step forward because it you know, it at the core of the G7 finance interest, climate is part of the equation. So this is just an example of it. So based on what I just said, we're going to do an exercise on the Jamboard, and I must admit, I am not a Jamboard expert. I am a dinosaur when it comes to Jamboard. So at some point, I'm going to ask Kel to maybe go through a bit of the logistic on the sticky notes. So if you look at the slide 10 of the Jamboard, we're gonna be separating ourselves in 5 different groups. And so this session particularly, we're gonna use it to strategize around the overarching priority areas that could fit into the G7 2021 agenda. And then one of the key elements here when we speak about convergence is explore the opportunities for joint stream of work with the G20 Italian presidency in 2021. So not only what the G7 can do along the lines of I've just mentioned, but also how there could be a separate stream of work or let's say a joint stream of work with the G20 Italian president agenda. So the aim of the session is to draw on the convergence across the issues to ensure that there is not a focus on silos, but on the broader message on global priorities for the G7. And then to draw out which issues cross between the G7 and G20 platforms. So we're going to break into breakout groups to do so. We're going to have facilitators. So myself, Kel, Lauren, John, and Tristan, maybe you could turn on your camera for a second before we go into breakout groups. Excellent. And so when you look at the Jamboard on page 10, there are first of all a box on the top that is called G7 response to global threats and issues. So essentially there what we want to try to get as an outcome is an understanding on the space of the G7 in response to the crisis on multilateralism and on the different types of crises that are arriving. So what is the place of the G7 to respond to the pandemic? We've seen it extremely upset in 2020, but people were not looking for the G7 to do something. We turned into the G20 for that kind of leadership. If the G7 wants to come back in 2021, what is it that the G7 needs to do to respond to global threats? So there we think about health, economic, nature, biodiversity crisis. And so below you have 4 different columns. And so for each of the columns, our assumptions are that these are the pillars that will be part of the UK G7 agenda. So there, one of the key objective is for you to highlight what are the things that particularly fit, for example, within the climate and biodiversity agenda, but that could be linked into other pillars. So for example, on nature and biodiversity, a policy area that tries to link the protection of biodiversity within the environment stream, that fits into the climate and biodiversity column, but you really specify that there is a clear link with the COVID-19 pandemic preparedness pillar. So that is the exercise that we try to do. And then on the other slide, where's the G20 and G7 slide? Okay, so the slide 14, what does a G7 and G20 joint agenda look like? That is where, based on the previous discussion that we had on priorities for the G7, then we try to eliminate, those things that we feel will not be dealt with just by the G7, but that could be part of a broader G7 and G20 joint agenda in 2021. So this is the exercise that we want to do. And Kel, I don't know if you want to add something, or maybe we could take some questions.
Yeah, great. And just going through what Eddie said, the idea here is really just to build this convergence, this matrix, seeing cross issues. How do we get what could be a single issue approach into these bigger conversations? We're doing a Jamboard, which is a little awkward. I'm not going to argue that. We're going to, each breakout room will have its two different Jamboards, one on policy convergence in breakout room 1, for example, you'll see the top left-hand side, and then one later on G7 to 20. You'll just have to page your way through that. Again, not ideal, but really wanted to make sure everyone's on the same page and we weren't too limited. We do have some issues with some access to Jamboard. Apparently Jamboard cuts off at a certain number, and we're looking into that. And hopefully you can figure that out, but we can deal with it in the chat room as well if you want to add issues. So that's basically what we're going to looking to do. We're going to randomly select you to breakout rooms. We're doing it randomly, so we do have that cross-pollination. We're going to have the workshops on the issues where you can really delve down into your particular issues. That's going to happen during the week before the next meeting. But this is really just in cross-pollination, sharing ideas around these big buckets. That's the process here. Is there any questions? Just quick hands up for any quick procedural questions rather than sort of deep ideological questions. Okay.
Good question. Can't get into the Jamboard.
Yes, we're working on that one. We're not entirely sure why that is. We apologize for that. So when you go into your breakout room, Elizabeth, we'll connect you with someone who's on the Jamboard, and you can just work through the chat with them. And I apologize for this logistic thing. We didn't realize they're the Jamboard.
I think maybe what we could do there is in the group where Elizabeth will be, the moderator can just share the screen.
Good idea. Good idea. Okay, so moderators, we can make that happen. Any other questions? Toko, did you have your hand up?
I did, Cal. Thanks very much. I was just looking at the list that you have of those issues and how they speak to what we had this morning, particularly looking at some of those 4 buckets there. Could you speak a little about how they sort of, how are you looking at these as more cross-cutting rather than anything? I'm a little bit unsure about those 4 in relation to this morning's conversations.
Well, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they were pretty much reflected in today's conversations. I think the things we're missing there maybe is on the open government stuff, which you could possibly say is on the G7 multilateralism perspective. But otherwise, I think they're roughly what we heard from today. And so what we're going to do here is, for example, if you're working on girls' education, we know that's Prime Minister Johnson's issue, and he's going to put that on the agenda. But we can also look at, Build Back Better, jobs and economy. How does girls' education fit into that? COVID pandemic preparedness. We know that from the Ebola experience that girls are last to be back into education. How do we build that into plans for a COVID response? And you're basically just trying to build up these, how we can work across the issues. Ultimately, and I'll share that later, and it's actually in the Google Drive, is an Excel sheet, which will actually across these, you'll have these top buckets. I'm going across the Y axis, and on the x-axis. On the y-axis, you're going to have all the different issues, and we're going to try to build a really strong policy matrix, and that will be our ambition over the next couple of weeks as we go through workshops and then into our planning before the G7. This is just an initial step, just to get us into that thinking mode, thinking about how we're going to work across the sectors. And the game here is so we don't just talk about COVID and climate next year. We can actually get more issues onto that agenda. Is everybody relatively happy? Not going to get total happiness. Okay. So what we're going to do now is we're going to randomly split into your breakout rooms. You're going to be forced in there by Matt, who's helping out here. And then we're going to, after 4 minutes, we'll come back in the plenary and have report backs. Give us a couple minutes while we have to move the facilitators into the right room. So just give it a couple minutes to get set up, and then we'll head off. So ready to move into your breakout rooms? Matt, press the button. There we go. Start recording. So thank you very much. I hope those were good discussions. I know my group in Breakout Room had a good discussion. So let's go straight into the report backs. And let's go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so group number 1, and Vinella, I think you're reporting back for us. So are you happy to do that? We got Vinella there.
Hi. Let me just, I'm managing so many different windows at once. So I need to go back to slide 9, is that right? Great. Hi everybody. Oh, I'm gonna have to just zoom in on this because my eyes are not as young as they used to be, even if my optician says I have 20/20 vision. We started to look across the top at, oh dear, I'm accidentally moving things around, which is not what I wanted to do. So we started to look across the top. You can see this on slide 9 as well, if you want to follow there, at some of the kind of cross-cutting issues or themes or narrative that we might bring. There was some good discussion around civic space and participation, and a kind of call for the G7 to more seriously legitimize grassroots CSOs as part of kind of democratization agenda. Discussion about what the G7 means and the fact that it's a community of values. You know, maybe there's an opportunity for those values to be kind of strengthened or sharpened or brought more to the fore now in this new era post-Trump. The fact that there's a place for Biden to set his agenda despite the fact that he's not the host. The G8 being a venue for gaining momentum around member goals. Push the G7 to approach COVID-19 climate, build back better packages that are linked and comprehensive. Avoid national perspectives to the health response. It has to be global and linked to other systems like climate, and also some discussion there we had in our group around multilateralism in health. And time to introduce or advance new areas for the G7 as this is the time. And I think that was kind of a concluding point, reflecting back on all of those different contextual factors. We don't have anything on climate or biodiversity in our group. I guess we just didn't have those folks in the room or on the screen. We had some discussion around the gender equality and inclusiveness agenda, and a strong emphasis on the fact that yes, we know that the UK is interested in girls' education, but you know, there's a real risk that that is a limited agenda that allows the UK to actually kind of say very little and commit to very little and not garner anything particularly new, while also risking the whole women's rights agenda being reduced to that single issue. So a kind of strong message that girls' education can't be a proxy for gender and women's equality more broadly. You know, full disclosure, I put this post-it here, you know, as much as my organisation Frontline AIDS would absolutely second that wider message. If girls' education is on the agenda, we're certainly interested in trying to bring issues around comprehensive sexuality along with that, but you know, fully recognise that that would only be one tiny piece of what has to be a much bigger and more compelling puzzle. And down here we've also got education should be universal and inclusive, education of girls and of children with disabilities. Then under COVID-19 pandemic preparedness, we've got something about can COVID-19 be the entry point for other issues like economics? And I guess that's part preparedness, but it's part learning as well, isn't it? And then in the Build Back Better category, we've got you know, the fact that COVID-19 has emphasized in many ways the huge burden of care that falls on women and girls, and perhaps created some opportunities to bring that issue of the care economy and kind of feminist analysis more broadly into the economic part. Another point that came from myself was around health systems, and we've also learned that when health systems are neglected and we don't invest in them for years and years, then when there is a health crisis, the health system can very quickly crumble and isn't strong enough to stand up. And so can we try to position the issue of increased health investment? Then we had some comments about the sort of risks around the health security agenda. And again, that's something we're seeing in the HIV sector with the Global Fund for AIDS, TB and Malaria pushing the agenda of global health security. And, actually that can very quickly turn into a nationalistic or kind of closing borders approach. And we need to sort of be careful to make sure that that's defined in terms of, health-related risks like antimicrobial resistance, what's happened with COVID, the transmission of viruses from animals to humans because of conditions that animals may be kept in. And sorry, I'm paraphrasing for someone else who spoke here, so I hope I've communicated that correctly, but just some awareness of those sorts of issues. And then one more post-it has come up while I've been on. Work and employment is not inclusive, and the policies and stigma exclude people with disabilities, but also the potential that if people with disabilities are given opportunities, the potential for what they can do. Access to employment for people with disability is their right. And yeah, I think none of us would object to that. And I think there's a good crossover there also with some of the other issues that have come up around gender as well, and women with disabilities and reproductive health and all of those things. I think there's lots of intersections there. So hope that gives the other groups something to build on.
Great. And let's go straight into group number 2 for the report backs and take a round up after all report backs. Who's reporting?
That would be me. We had a very reachful discussion. So on the responsive to the global threats, I think, the first thing is, and, it builds a lot on what has said previously, but I think one key strategic element was that the G7 might have the capacity to take a lead early in the year to respond to global threats if it's able to identify a niche, if it's able to offer a message of unity, if it's able to propose something that the G7 leaders are able to deliver. So on finance or on how to provide solidarity towards more vulnerable countries. And there was mention about this EU level approach to discuss about economic governance approach. And so something to explore. Then, of course, there is this importance on the nexus between pandemic impacts, economic impacts, and climate crisis, and a joint response that builds on the UK manifesto commitments, which someone in the room mentioned. But then we also need to understand that there are going to be some geopolitical differences, particularly on trade. But there are also discussions on trade modernization. That also includes, for example, the relationship between the US and China. The G7 might have something to say that is aligned to the messages of like-minded countries on this. However, we must understand that the UK would want to use Brexit narrative to be seen as a strong nation that is independent, that wants to take a lead on its own, separated from the EU. So that is also going to shape the narrative. And there are other very important issues that the G7 has been responsive to in the past that are also part of the health crisis, particularly on impacts of C19 on AIDS, TB and malaria, and other health issues related, for example, to sexual, reproductive, and health rights. And also we can't, on global issues, there are other elements like world hunger, food security, and those socioeconomic impacts that the G7 cannot forget, particularly on impacts on livelihoods and conflict. Then when we go into specific details, we did have a discussion about linkages on, for example, climate protection, building resilience to avoid future pandemics. So that was a key component of our discussion, but also bringing other issues such as climate displacement to be looked at in a much more meaningful way, and linkages, for example, with girls' education and gender responsiveness to climate, to the economic crisis, to support health systems, vaccinations, and so on. And then when it comes to gender equality and inclusiveness, taking into consideration that 80% increase in global hunger due to the socioeconomic impacts on COVID, that is something that the G7 can be responsive to. And we move towards linkages between gender equality and inclusiveness to issues like need for a few concrete deliverables that make the linkage between pandemic preparedness and research and development, the integration of health systems approach, and the global health security framework, the right for health and the public access to health, and how that the access to health has a differentiated approach globally. And when it comes to COVID-19 pandemic preparedness, we thought about the message from Boris Johnson on the One Health agenda, a message that he brought to UNGA, and finance. So finance to support much more nuance. It looks like the UK is really focusing on vaccination only, but financial support from the G7 needs to be more nuanced and more holistic. And we can't forget that between pandemic preparedness and economic recovery, there is a debt crisis happening within middle-income countries that is affecting their capacity to respond to their own emergencies inside. And so they're facing fiscal space constraints. And so there are many discussions happening within the G20, but the G7 needs to adapt its response to it. Of course, when it comes to Build Back Better and the economic recovery, we thought about how this crisis has shown racial injustice and economic injustice in many, if not all, countries. And the element of racial injustice, it's something that Biden might want to bring into the G7 agenda, and he might find that other countries will join Biden on those efforts. But also looking inwards, G7 countries, we can't forget the issue of jobs, just transition, and social safety nets, which were particularly impacted during this crisis, and show that the systems were weak to respond. And we also spoke about differences between the G7 and the G20, and there's one very specific difference, which is that the G20 already has a health track, and the other one is that the Germans and Italians are already thinking about bringing the Indian upcoming presidency in 2022. And so how do we make not just a 1-year approach, but a 2 years approach? That's it.
Excellent. Thank you. Brilliant. Group 3. Who's the rapporteur? Amy.
Hi, I think we were group 3. We weren't quite sure whether we were group 3 or group 4, but we filled out the group 3 thing on Jamboard, so we're now group 3. We talked a lot about all the different program areas and issue areas that we were working on, and we found that we worked on things that were very cross-cutting. We could kind of fill in all the boxes of things that we all worked together or worked on, like SRHR, nutrition, working with people with disabilities, health systems, things like that. We found that they were all cross-cutting areas. So there was lots of areas that we could fill in the boxes there on. We talked, I guess, in terms of COVID-19, we talked a lot about maintaining our past wins and successes and not losing ground. It's building back better, but also maintaining the progress that has been made. COVID has really only highlighted the inequities around the world, and that there are still inequities around the world. We don't want to roll back on the commitments that have been made to global aid. We don't want to roll back on the commitments to 0.7 in the UK, to 10 years of global action on SDGs. We don't want to forget about other infectious diseases, particularly mentioned was AIDS, malaria, TB, and neglected tropical diseases from my own perspective. There's a fragility to that progress that has been made in SRHR and nutrition and in health systems that, a lot of focus on COVID-19, if that happens in the G7 or happens in the other forums they're meeting, threatens to kind of take away some of that attention. Where we were a little bit worried about a narrowing of the agenda in the G7 and kind of narrowing of the global appetite to talk about bigger picture issues. We didn't really want to focus all the attention on COVID, on the vaccines, on the global recession. These are all threats that we saw as, taking away from some of the advocacy that we were able to do. Overall, it was really heartening to kind of hear about all the different, from my own opinion, I work in a quite small health issue, but hearing how all our different issues can kind of work together on some of this work was really great to hear. And I hope I've done my team well by summarizing what we talked about.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And we'll have a chance just for catch-ups for anybody's points missed. But moving on to group 4, who's reporting back on that one?
Hi, I am Katie from WaterAid. I'll maybe skip over some of the things that we talked about that other groups have already talked about, which is an advantage of going later in the process. But in terms of kind of cross-cutting issues, I think we also got a little bit into kind of a strategy campaigning trajectory, which I know we're talking about more next week, but thinking about how we talk about our particular issues in a way that will speak to the G7 agenda and get us out of our silos, as you were saying earlier, Cal. So the first thing we talked about was pollution pricing as both a way of climate mitigation, but also generating revenue for families, for education, for health, for a lot of the other sort of cross-cutting development priorities, and kind of seeing the G7 as an opportunity to push specific ideas and concrete solutions like pollution pricing or carbon taxes that collectively the industrialized countries could take, also as part of kind of building back better in this just green recovery from COVID that has been on a lot of people's minds. An interesting conversation about a way to talk about vaccines that's beyond sort of solving the immediate COVID emergency, but also looking at how it can kind of set precedent for collective action and moving away from nationalism on overall kind of funding the things that people need to support their right to health, right to food, et cetera. So kind of positioning that as a touch point issue that then, if we make progress on this, can then kind of lead us in a better, more multilateral direction. We talked about nutrition and WASH, water, sanitation, and hygiene. I talked a little bit about how at WaterAid we're trying to position WASH in terms of climate adaptation, in terms of Build Back Better, as kind of a measure of what's required for resilient, productive societies, but also looking to do that in a way that builds coalition, so that we're not saying that any one issue is kind of more important than the others, but saying there's a package of essential public services that need to be funded in industrialized and developing countries alike, and that the G7, as they think about COVID response and recovery, especially from the recession, need to be thinking about kind of what are the ingredients for the kind of societies that we need to see to make sure this doesn't happen again. So we talked a lot about social protection, about support for informal workers, which also connects to gender equality, and as the first group mentioned, the kind of highlighting of the unpaid care work done by women and girls, especially in the context of COVID, and how maybe this is kind of again a touch point moment to shift some of that. And then obviously debt cancellation, which is of course a huge link with the G20, with the DSSI, and needing to really rally around cancellation, not just suspension, longer term debt sustainability, and looking at, you know, really what's the leadership of the G7 moving into the G20 of what they're really going to do about this, because otherwise countries will just take on more debt to deal with COVID, and the world will end up in a worse situation, which is the trajectory we're seeing. And then I guess the only other thing to point out, I mean, obviously a lot of the sort of big ticket issues link G7 to G20 on debt, on social protection. A lot of this can kind of carry through. And then the sort of obvious one is climate, given that Italy, as the G20 host, is also technically co-hosting COP. So that's just one more thing to point out, but I hope I've captured it all in case anyone wants to jump in from my group. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. And just go to group 5 for the final report back.
Does anyone from our group want to jump in on high-level thematic pieces?
Yes, at the end of our this consultation, I just mentioned that about inclusivity. And inclusivity will be the overarching goal. It should incorporate all marginalized people, women, elderly, persons with disabilities, with other ethnic minority groups who are marginalized and on the bottom. So I think inclusivity will be everywhere. Thank you.
Thanks, Mishara. So yeah, as Mishara said, our group sort of looked at those high-level themes and less sort of the policy links, which we know exist and we have discussed and we're all experts in that, and more to that sort of broad overarching narrative and how are we linking them in a way that is understandable and clear, and that ever eternal balance between a laundry list of disjointed priorities that include absolutely everything, while still being inclusive, and giving people space for things that really matter. We talked a lot about how we target and unlock the financing flows that we know are going to happen, and how we make our issues connect to priorities that will get money. So how we divert money to the things we care about and we think is right, by having that connectedness. And then we talked about some of the potential mechanisms, not just the policy connections between our issues at G7, G20, and other forums, but also the literal physical mechanisms by which we can force them together or create space for them to be shared. It's not enough to know that the policy issues are linked. There is also an onus on us to deliberately create the space to push participants into that space so they start connecting. And then finally, we sort of dismantled the categories, I think, talking about, you know, gender equality is an economic issue. It's not a nice to have. Climate is an economic issue. That this Build Back Better, if it's solely about jobs, which tend to be male infrastructure type jobs, or debt, and the sort of coded male technical things, and doesn't include things like the care economy, is clearly an economic issue. So really rejecting the false dichotomies and restrictive categories around how policymakers often see the work we do.
Excellent, thank you. Great points. So we're slightly over time. So is there any pressing issues that weren't raised, or you feel that need to be aired? Anybody want to just share a couple things? Okay. And Eddie, do you want any comments on the process? Anything you wanted to add or say?
I actually feel that there's a lot of elements that were mentioned across all the groups. So I think the next step forward is to bring all this information together. Of course, as it always happens, there are two things that we need to look at. The first one is the UK's own agenda, which has not been decided and will be discussed and presented to G7 countries before is public. But I mean, they're going to set their priorities. And I think one key exercise for us moving forward is to do cross-pollination of issues. So I guess it would be good then to take all this back, maybe present a cleaner document with these high-level priorities, and then a second exercise would be to go specifically on key policy areas as we have done in the past in the coming days and weeks.
Great, thanks. And that's my commitment to you, it's the group, and perhaps work with you, Eddie, is to take those jam boards, put it together in a comprehensive document and present it back to you guys, looking at the bigger picture stuff. And as Eddie says, the individual policy stuff are going to be dealt with in the workshops coming over the next couple of days. So along with the recording of this event, I'll try to package that information that we've done and shared in that really interesting sessions, the Greco sessions, in an easily formatted way that we can all sort of take on board and digest. So that kind of brings the end of the first day. This is the policy and the politics, getting an idea of where we're at and what the agenda items, and getting that cross-convergent mindset going. What we're going to do now is we're going to have working groups for those who know the task force well. And if you look at page, one of the pages in the Jamboard near the end, it has the different working groups. We have climate is going to take climate. We have education. We have global health, COVID-19. We have women and gender, and then food security, nutrition, and agriculture working groups happening on consecutive days. That's where we're going to go in their detail. We're going to be able to share those ideas around those specific policy areas, and then build some, try to fill in the matrix across those issues. So we start percolating up common areas and common ways of working, and that we can fill that matrix out. That's going to happen, and then we're going to come back on the 19th, 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 12 noon UK, and 1 p.m. EU time, and we're going to go through the hearing and report backs in the working groups, getting an idea of what the timeline is for 2021, looking at what are the campaign initiatives going out there, and then putting together some joint advocacy plans and ways of working going forward. So that's going to be sort of the action and looking ahead day of this multi-day event for the G7 Global Strategy Meeting. Just really want to thank some of our sponsors, United Combat NTDs and Women Deliver. Really appreciate that, and obviously thank you all for coming and joining us. Thanks to Matt and Joe, giving some great technical support and helping out delivering this from Uniting, and also thanks to our Japanese colleagues. And I think it's something like 12:30 in the morning there, so fantastic commitment from you guys for enduring and staying with us. But there we go. Any questions, shoot me any questions by email. Happy to follow up. This is sort of a working session going through to the 19th. We'll get some details back to you. Take a look at the Google Drive. I'll share them by email. But really thanks for your time. Really fantastic engagement discussion today. And I really appreciate all the contributions that you've all made to making this a useful strategy session. So we'll end here today. We'll pick up again in plenary 19th. But in the meantime, have fun and good luck with your working groups. Bye, everyone.